think it is now on my, it should be now coming live on my Facebook feed. It might be the easier thing to do, but let's see. Is Claudia here yet?
Doesn't look like it.
I can't see
No.
them in the attendees. Just to let you know, Athena, it says now that the meeting is now streaming live on Facebook.
Okay, that is great. So shall we perhaps start then?
Yeah, can you just send me the link to the live stream on your? No, I see it. Don't worry.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, welcome everyone. They will always have these symptoms, it seems to me, with these technologies. I want to thank everyone for finding the time and during these hungry times for time, I suppose, to be here today. I thought that in CAMEo, the Institute of Culture and Media Economies that I'm now interim director for, we should be doing a little bit more to create a space where people can discuss things that are actually happening, and especially the city of Leicester, who has been in lockdown since July now, and has witnessed also a big protest in June for Black Lives Matter. I thought we could discuss, first of all, how young people were involved in this protest, and whether more opportunities would be given for young people in this city, and that because they are the future of the city. Also, what are these politics of the July lockdown and that are continuing because because the COVID pandemic has affected the BAME communities disproportionately, and also in relation to the lockdown itself and why it happened in Leicester, the unique lockdown. We're the first city to go under a unique lockdown, and that's related to labor conditions in certain so-called dark factories that had that these factories have a long history that have been reported already the past few years. It was not a secret, also in Parliament and so on. And also, how can we look at how people organize also every day to resist some of the xenophobia, racism, and polarization in public discourse, not just about Leicester, but more broadly. So with all that in mind, I have asked activists from the BLM protest to be here to talk to us about that, but also academics that work and research in related fields to the ones that we've been discussing. What I don't want to do here now is to name everyone and what they're doing, because I would prefer that they tell us themselves, or before I introduce them, I will say something about each one. So we have a great list of people here today to talk about Leicester in protest and Leicester in lockdown. And I would like to thank Paula actually for helping organize this, and Civic Leicester and Ambrose in particular for bringing me in touch with some of the speakers here that were crucial for this event to happen. So without saying anything more, I think I am ready to introduce Claudia, if she's actually here, if she can unmute herself. If she is here, I don't know. She is here.
I am indeed here.
Hi, Claudia. It is a great pleasure to have you here. Claudia Webbe is a member of Parliament and represents the constituency of Leicester East, and is a politician with the British Labour Party. Claudia, if you can give us your thoughts on how you experienced and how your constituents perhaps also experienced the Leicester lockdown, and your thoughts about the situation.
Ina, sorry to interrupt. Before Claudia starts, can you press record, because I don't have permission to record.
Sorry, yes, I will do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi, I hope that you can see me and hear me clearly. And I thank you for really inviting me to this event. My name, of course, is Claudia Webbe, and I am proud to be the Labour Member of Parliament for Leicester East. I'm actually delighted to be joining you for this important event. And I want to really thank the University of Leicester, not only for inviting me today, but also for its immense contribution to our city. This has been an incredibly difficult and tumultuous time for Leicester as our residents continue to face coronavirus restrictions. Parts of the country do not. I am immensely grateful to all the frontline workers who have tirelessly and selfishly protected us. And thanks to the hard work of Leicester's health workers, council and residents, incident rates have actually been declining across our city, but equally, they have recently shot up. They remain considerably higher than the national average. Our city had more COVID-19 deaths than any other part of England and Wales in July. And according to figures from the ONS, 24 people died tragically in Leicester, as opposed to 90% of local authorities which registered less than 10 deaths. This is a tragic reminder of the government's failure to keep our city safe. Yet coronavirus has not been the only issue of significance for Leicester in recent months. And I'm incredibly proud of the multicultural and of culturalism and diversity of my home city. Leicester is one of the most ethnically and culturally diverse places in the UK, with over 2/3 of our city of an African, Asian or minority ethnic background. That is the representation of Leicester East. Our diversity is our strength. We are the city where the minorities make up the majority, and we are richer for the vibrant exchange of cultures. Yet this means that Leicester is more deeply affected by the global instances of brutal institutional racism, which have been particularly prominent in recent months. And I stand in full solidarity with the Black Lives Matter protests, and I will always support activists in Leicester and across the UK and across the world who safely and peacefully oppose systems of racist oppression. You see, despite the many successes of the Black Lives Matter movement so far, recent events demonstrate how much there is still to do. We know that Leicester is not immune from the disease of racism. This was painfully demonstrated in May this year when a BBC News reporter suffered racist abuse whilst filming in our city. And I know that too many people present today, along with myself, will have endured abhorrent racist abuse. The brutality of institutional racism in the UK affects all walks of life, and the police use of force, from the police use of force to the racial pay gaps, to the disproportionate number of Black children who go to bed hungry. This is the extent of the disproportionality that we face. Black people disproportionately suffer from police use of force in the UK, are more likely to be charged and are overrepresented in the prison population. Here in Leicester, a Black person is 5 times more likely to be stopped and searched than a white person. As in America, it appears the police can act with impunity, as very little will be done in terms of enabling them to face criminal prosecution. And it's also been of particular concern and been extremely concerning to see the disproportionate impact of the coronavirus upon African, Asian and minority ethnic communities, because the severe racial disparities in our economy mean that they are more likely to fall through the cracks of the government's financial support and are therefore more likely to be forced to work in unsafe conditions. The grim intersection of racial and class discrimination has a deadly consequence during this pandemic. Nowhere is this clearer than in the sections of Leicester's garment industry, where a resurgence of media reports has highlighted instances of severe exploitation. I have been helping many people in my constituency who are garment industry workers over the last few months, and the recurring issues are disgraceful. Really, we're talking about sweatshops routinely reporting hours, and the threat, in fact, of redundancy is often used as to leverage to stop workers from whistleblowing. Factory overcrowding is also commonplace, and with a lack of personal protective equipment, this has undoubtedly, in my view, contributed to the high levels of COVID-19 in our city. Whilst most of the workers in Leicester's garment industry who have approached me for help are British citizens, there are also a significant number of migrant workers who are either undocumented or have no recourse to public funds. These workers, who are predominantly women, are often particularly vulnerable of exploitation in terms of pay exploitation in particular. This demonstrates the modern working class. It actually demonstrates the modern working class is a diverse mix of nationalities, ethnicities, genders, and sexualities. We must ensure that all workers in Leicester and across the UK are protected against an all-encompassing evil such as institutional racism. It is often difficult to know where we in Leicester can actually begin. But we have to begin to address this problem. But I believe there are many things that we must do to ensure that Black lives truly matter. We must reform the UK's racist criminal justice system. We must deliver justice for the victims of racialized state violence, especially for the Windrush generation. We must transform our British education system to teach the truthful history of colonialism, of imperialism, and the transatlantic slave trade. We must fight to end racist policies like no recourse to public funds and the hostile environment. Ultimately, we must ensure that we transform, in a sense, or we put an end to empty platitudes, because it's up to those in power to prove with their actions that Black lives not matter, not just say that they do. So I would just like to finish by saying that one of the most inspiring aspects of the Black Lives Matter movement has been the leadership, energy, and contribution of young people. It fills me with hope to see that it fills me with hope for the future, to actually see the fantastic organizing that the younger generation has already demonstrated. Because the existential crisis we face, from institutional racism to climate breakdown, require radical solutions. Yet I know that young people have been creative, but have the creative ambition and skills to tackle these injustices head on. So solidarity, and thank you.
Thank you, Claudia, for this very inspiring speech. And you don't get that very often from politicians, so I really appreciated this. I was wondering if there are questions we can take from the audience here. If you want to use the chat to do that, that would be good. And while we're waiting, I wanted to ask you how you thought, particularly you mentioned garment workers and the situation that affected them, and they were also demonized because of the lockdown as well, and the overall issue there. Can you talk a little bit about those constituents and share some of the perhaps the testimonials that they gave you and the stories behind how you interacted with them and what the issues are there?
Well, I mean, it's as you said also in the beginning of your introduction, and as I've said also, it is one of the most exploitative situations to see people not being paid nowhere near the minimum wage, let alone the living wage. And, you know, to see that employers are actually underreporting people's pay. So people can go to work for 55 hours a week and receive a pay slip that reflect 20 hours a week. This is exploitative. And in a sense, without workers having a voice through having unionized workplaces, then in a sense, we are not hearing those voices. And I don't know whether it's because I'm female, why I'm being approached now, but I know that what we've got still is people not being prepared to go on the record, even though they know that what is happening to them is wrong. And we do need to get to the depth of understanding why that is. Why people are not prepared to go on the record on this, because worker exploitation is nothing new. It's not something that is just particular to Leicester. We've seen it all over the UK. We know that, for example, carers are often not paid the minimum wage. And we know from the stories that we've seen with regards to McDonald's and other employers like Sports Direct, we know that this is not a particular phenomenon that besets Leicester's workers. But what we do know is that those workers in those other industries were prepared to speak up and speak out, and were prepared to organize with a union to get some justice and to get their voices heard. For 10 years, we've had a situation here in Leicester where it's been reported time and time again about the exploitation that people are experiencing. And as you said in your start, the government has long been aware of exploitation in Leicester, yet have failed to act. And I believe it's shameful that the Conservatives have neglected to act, despite widespread and long-standing evidence of gross employer misconduct. And why I say that the government has failed to act, because there's not just been one internal select committee inquiry, government select committee inquiry, but there's been two parliamentary inquiries to what is happening in terms of worker exploitation, and a set of recommendations which, if implemented, would have been able to address the problem. But what we've had is a situation where the government have underfunded the very institutions that could actually regulate the industry. For example, the biggest threat to workers that approach me is really the issue of pay. And the body that's meant to regulate and enforce the minimum wage is Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. But since 2010, that body has been underfunded, if you like, had their funding withdrawn and had their staffing halved. So they've not had the resources to do what is necessary to enforce the minimum wage. It's all very well having legislation, and the minimum wage, you will know, came in force in 1997 by a Labour government, 1999 by the time it was implemented. So it's all very well to have these legislations that protect workers, but if that is not being regulated and enforced, and there is not a body that is doing that work, then essentially bosses are getting away with absolute scandal, and they're being driven by this because they are seeking to meet the demand of brands, and the brands are fueling a marketing ploy of fast fashion. So we're not only engaged as consumers in something which is fast fashion, throwaway fashion, something which is not even ethical. We are also not looking behind the labels that we wear to see whether or not actually there's worker exploitation that are producing the clothes that we wear on our backs. So this is not happening in some far flung part of the world. This is happening here in Leicester. And what we need to do is obviously address this problem, because there was, for example, so many workers who started to work in the industry in 1992, and their pay hasn't gone up since that time. So they started off at earning £5 an hour, and today they're still earning £5 an hour. This is not right. By 1999, they should have been being paid the minimum wage at the very least. And as that has increased year on year, then they should be increasing alongside that. But let's not forget, Leicester's garment industry was actually the jewel in the crown of garment manufacturers in the UK. In fact, as far back as 1935, Leicester was one of the richest cities in Europe. Why? Because of its garment industry, which was known across the UK and Europe at least. And so it was one of the things that we held up in very high esteem. But changes have happened over the last few years, 10 years, 15 years perhaps, where we've seen the rise of this concept called fast fashion. And it's a far cry from when I was growing up in Leicester, where my mother, who worked in the garment industry, skilled as a seamstress and a machinist, but absolutely I was brought up with the notion that she was making clothes to last. Those days seem to have long gone, and we're now making clothes to throw away. And that is wrong, because behind every garment that is produced in Leicester is a worker that is being underpaid and therefore exploited. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. I think, as I'm aware of time as well, I would like to move on with George Cole, if he's here and he can unmute himself, who is the councillor for Western Park for the City of Leicester. If he's here, hi.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you really well, George.
Unfortunately, I haven't got much time because I have another meeting to get to. I've listened very closely to what Claudia said, and I do feel she's covered pretty much all of the space in terms of what's happening in Leicester. And there's little point in me echoing or repeating it, other than to say, I do know that in the City Council, a lot of effort is being put in to make good the situation that we find in Leicester East with regard to the garment industry. And I know that a lot of effort had gone in the past, but clearly its effectiveness is being shown at the moment. But as I said, I do know that it is up there on the agenda of the City Council to put it right and get it sorted out, because exploitation of people in this day and age, in the way in which it's being done in the garment industry, is something that we should all stand up and shout about and say it isn't right, and we must approach it not just from an ethical point of view, but also from a moral point of view, that it's not right. I suppose, because my time is limited, what I really want to comment on really is the protests in the city. And essentially, what we saw that took place was a real expression of how people felt about the moral injustice that a white supremacist country can impose on people that are not white. And for me, the significance of the protest around the world is that there was a time when protests like those would be predominantly involve people of African heritage background, Black people. And in many ways, that would be perceived by white folks as Black people complaining yet again. But what the recent protests globally has demonstrated is that white people are beginning to get it, and beginning to get it when Black people say, having your knees on our neck is a real big problem. And it is a big problem not just for Black people and society as a whole, but it is a big problem if we talk in terms of how do we eradicate from our systems and from our way of thinking the injustice that we all suffer from, Black people as well as white people. And the problem that I see in terms of the current situation is that whilst there are more white people taking part in the protest and other non-Black people, and by non-Black people, I'm thinking of African heritage people. By Black people, I'm thinking of African heritage people. Whilst there are more non-African heritage people taking part in these protests, I'm wanting to think that their contribution is a real one, a real attempt to try and address the issue of racism within our society, within our systems, etc. My fear, however, is that, like fashion, these things will come and go in the minds of the people who are not affected by the racism on a daily basis. My hope, however, is that if we can agree that as George Floyd experienced the difficulty that caused him to lose his life, say, in the earlier part of the 20th century, if we can agree that not as many white people would have been out protesting, A, because of what they think they stand to lose at the hands of their employers and the authority. And if we say that in the current day and age, those white people stand to lose even less, then we can see how they will feel more able and willing to participate in the protest. But participating in the protest doesn't solve the problem. What actually solves the problem is white people recognizing that racism is their problem, and it's a problem that they impose on Black people, and they have got to find a way of resolving that problem within themselves and within their institution. And we as Black people are here to offer the help and support that is needed to ensure that that happens. And fundamentally what I'm saying is, it's okay having this diverse group of people protesting in relation to Black Lives Matter. But we've seen that over the years. What's really now needed is white folks taking real action, government coming up with policies that address these issues, policing these policies, enforcing these policies, and having a means of saying, if you break these policies, these are the consequences, and to make these consequences real. I'll end by saying, it's not my belief that we can end racism as it stands, because it seems ingrained in the way in which we as human beings are. But what we can do, we can, like we've done in many other areas, we can create systems that combat racism in a real way and create systems that punishes people who exercise racism as a means of showing their supremacy or by whatever other means. And if those punishments are real and substantive, then we have a way of controlling the effects of racism in society as a whole. It's a moral issue. It's a real moral issue, and moral issues are not easy to solve.
Thank you, George. This is there's a lot to think about there for me, and I hope that what you're saying is taken into the soul and absorbed. I think I would like to invite now Henrietta O'Connor, if she's here, who is our head of college at the University of Leicester, Social Science, Arts and Humanities, but that's not the actual reason she's here. She's here because she researches young people in the labor market and marginalization and inequality and transition to work and these kind of issues. And I thought for that reason, her and the next speaker, who is John Goodwin, they're both professors in sociology, could offer us some thoughts and ideas about the particularities of the Leicester situation for perhaps from the perspective of their discipline and their expertise. So Henrietta, if you are here.
I am. Can you hear me?
Hi, welcome.
Yeah. Thanks, Athina. Okay, I'm going to disappoint you to start with because I'm going to leave John to talk about the sociological perspective, and I'm going to do something quite boring, but that I hope people will be vaguely interested in. I was going to talk about the perspective of the university when lockdown was first announced, because I think there are some insights to learn. Claudia kindly
more interesting actually. Please.
Well, let's see. Claudia kindly mentioned the significance of the University of Leicester in the beginning of her speech, and I think what I want to talk about today is to show how Leicester, as you know, how the university responded to the announcement of lockdown and the challenges that we faced on the senior team at the university and how that impacted on staff, students, and other stakeholders. Does that sound all right?
Fantastic.
Okay, before doing that, I just wanted to acknowledge what George just spoke about and the importance of what he talked about. And it made me reflect on another angle I could have taken on this speech, would be to talk about the importance of the University of Leicester in addressing the issues that George raised. I think as an institution, since our new Vice-Chancellor arrived, we have been much more proactive in what we're doing to combat racism, to try to be a more inclusive institution. And I'm looking forward to seeing how we develop that further, but we've got a lot to learn and a long way to go with that. And the driving force for us as an institution are our students. They are fantastic. They challenge us every step of the way. So we're trying to bring in initiatives, we're trying to take action in a positive way to begin to address that. But I'm going to be much more pedestrian in what I talk about now and go through our response to the announcement of lockdown and really how we handled that as an institution. So it comes as no surprise to any of you what happened in Leicester. On the 29th of June, we became the first city to face a local lockdown. This happened at exactly the same time the rest of the country started to open up pubs and restaurants for the first time since March. So we were living in this slightly odd parallel universe where the announcement was made about Leicester, whilst at the same time, people in Leicester were witnessing everybody else starting to have looser restrictions on them. And if you can cast your mind back to then, it was also just about the beginning of Leicester Fortnight, when the schools were beginning the transition into preparing for the school holidays. People had booked holidays much earlier than the rest of the country. It was really odd timing for us as a city. So we had to respond really quickly. The senior team at the university, like everybody else, were watching the announcement from Parliament that night. We didn't know what was going on until the lockdown was announced at 9 o'clock. So there was a lot of frantic action behind the scenes to think about how to respond to that for our staff, our students, and the kind of wider community. So I'm going to just talk briefly. I won't talk for too long, but I wanted to talk about a number of themes. First of all, our communication strategy when we realised what was happening and the severity of it, how we engaged externally across the community, a little bit about community cohesion and what we tried to do around community cohesion. I'm going to touch briefly on our COVID-related research and how we've responded to the crisis, and then a little bit about the future and the lessons that we learned. So beginning with the communications, I've already sort of set the scene around how we heard the announcement, the same as everybody else. So what we did quite quickly was to recognise the importance of communications with our staff, our students, our alumni, the governing body, partners of the institution. So this might sound bizarre, but there were things that we had to deal with, like deliveries that were due to be arriving the next day from around the country. Could these deliveries still come to campus? Some of those deliveries were things like lab equipment or chemicals that laboratories needed. And we had to be really quick in our response to say, well, you can't come to campus, we need to do this differently. We also had we've got a number of estates projects going on. So we've got building companies employed by the university at Freeman's Common, at Brookfield, where they had different responses to the COVID crisis. So we had to put up a united front and make sure we were communicating the same message. So it was a challenging time, and I think the institution responded really well. For those of you who work at Leicester, you will know the first communications came out just before midnight, I think, on that when the announcement came out. And we had to respond really quickly because we knew staff were planning to come to work the next day as normal. So we had to quickly communicate with everybody, but in a really clear and transparent and fair way, fast and fair. So that was our first challenge, knowing that we had to do that and then follow that up with more detailed communications about what that meant for people on the ground. And just to stress, like for all of you, depending on what industries you work in, everybody was in the same boat. We had to respond really quickly to something that was out of everybody's normal experience. It was a huge, huge challenge. So first of all, we had no prior warning from the government this would happen, like everybody else. We had an inkling it might be coming, but we didn't have any prior warning. And I think some people would imagine that an institution as big as the university would have had a prior warning. We didn't, and it kind of reflects the government's approach to this generally. You'll all know there was ambiguity about the policy detail. We had no clue what the boundary was of the lockdown area, what it meant for different areas of the university. So was Oadby and Wigston included? If it was included, that had an impact on our halls of residence and the staff that work and the students that live out in Oadby and Wigston. None of us knew that. We had a concern about the reputation of the city being cast in a negative light amongst the rest of the UK and much wider than that internationally, and how that reputation, for us in a non-altruistic way, if you like, would also impact on the perception amongst prospective students. The lockdown happened at a point which is absolutely crucial to us as an institution in attracting students to Leicester. So that external perception was really important. And lastly, on that score, we knew, again, like all of you, that the unhelpful media coverage blaming minority communities for the outbreak risked sparking community tensions in what is otherwise a city that has a really positive track record for being diverse and vibrant and harmonious. Despite the problems that those of us that live here know are the reality of Leicester, the perception is that we're very harmonious. So we also felt quite isolated. Us and De Montfort were in the zone of lockdown. Colleagues spoke to people in other universities around this time, and they were breathing a sigh of relief. It wasn't them. They knew what panic we'd be in trying to resolve this. So we felt quite isolated. And actually, in recognition of that, Universities UK, which is one of our external bodies, have contacted the university and asked us to write a report on our response. So I can forward that later to the group if you're interested. So we did write a report around communications in the face of uncertainty, outlining the actions we took. So just a couple more points. One of the first things we did around external engagement was we joined our local resilience forum, and this has been a really positive experience for the institution. I don't know if other people here today are members of that forum, but it's been a fantastic force for good during the lockdown. We were able to make strategic and operational contribution to that group. We joined at the beginning, and we worked really closely with them to make sure that organisations across the city were issuing consistent and clear public health messages, despite what was coming from the government and the conflicting advice from elsewhere. So we were able to work really closely in partnership with local authorities, with the NHS, with public health, and to work towards the largest ever test and trace drive, which happened across the city during this period. We also put forward, well, they volunteered, we asked students and staff to volunteer to help out on this. So a lot of, over 200 of our staff and students were involved in the community effort to push forward with COVID testing, to make scrubs for the NHS. There were lots of different volunteering opportunities across the institution, and our staff and students really stepped up to that. Around the community cohesion piece, we were really worried as an institution and as individuals about the rise in racial hate crime on social media across some areas of the community within the city, and the media narratives around the spread of the outbreak being in specific areas of the city, kind of relating as well to what Claudia talked about with the dark factories issue. So the VC wrote a comment piece for the Leicester Mercury calling for unity and togetherness. Neil Chakraborty, who's the director of the Centre for Hate Studies and the head of criminology, published a video message which was publicised on social media and had a huge number of views, where he talked about the importance of the community pulling together. The university was also a lead partner in the initiative, which I know a number of you took part in, Together in Hope, which brought together diverse partners across the city, the football club, the religious communities and so on. And on campus, we worked really hard to reiterate our zero tolerance policy. We also were at the forefront of COVID-19 research. So the medical school in particular has been ranked as one of the top performing in the country for COVID-19 research. We've been awarded as an institution over £10 million since the pandemic began to look at the impact of COVID. And in line with what kind of city we are, I'm quite proud of the fact that researchers at the University of Leicester were the first to identify and to start to research the disproportionate impact on Black and Asian communities of COVID. So we're at the forefront of that research. There's also the research that came out of the School of Business a number of years ago around the garment factories, and suddenly the researchers who've been talking about this for a long time were called upon by national press to make comments on what they knew about the factories and how they'd been alerting us really to what was going on in these factories for a long time. Again, linking back to what Claudia talked about. So looking to the future, what happens next? But there are a number of lessons to be learned from what happened with us as an institution. I imagine there are other universities not too far from here, Birmingham in particular, who may be looking to us for advice and guidance in how to cope with a local lockdown. We were the first to go into lockdown. We know already we're not the last, and there will be other university cities facing the same challenges that we have. We're one of the first universities to have introduced a COVID-19 screening programme. That will start on campus on the 28th of September when the students come back. And I think and hope as an institution we've responded well. We've learned a lot. There's a lot more we can do, and it's not over yet. We all know that there's a lot more to come. So that's where we are at the moment. Happy to take questions. And Athina, I hope that helped to meet the remit of the afternoon.
Yes, that was wonderful, and thank you. I certainly have experienced good communication. Actually, it was one of those moments that our university was communicating well, so I was very happy to see it as a professional in communication. I was going to go to John, and perhaps if there are questions, we will take them after John. Would that be okay? Okay.
Yeah, that's great. Sorry if I overran.
No, you haven't. It's perfect timing. There is an invisible schedule that only I can see that's going really well. So, John.
Okay. So I'm going to try and share my screen in a second. But before I do, I just want to pick up on a couple of points. One is that what Claudia said is absolutely right. You know, Leicester had this title of, Leicester clothed the world. But the idea that somehow factory, the textile industry in Leicester in the past was not exploitative is problematic. Research that we've done on Leicester hosiery factories in the 1960s does show that jobs were precarious, people were underpaid, people were exploited. Work that we did in the 1990s with the Leicester Outwork campaign also showed that the hosiery factories were very exploitative, particularly of BAME community. So these debates are not new. What's frustrating is that we do the research, but that research doesn't always get translated into policy action. So we've known about this for a long time. Anyway, what I wanted to do was really, you know, I'm not from Leicester. Can you enable my screen sharing, Athena? I'm not from Leicester, but this is my adopted home. I've been here for 30 years, and I've worked in the city, I've lived in the city, I now live in the county. And one of the things that I was getting frustrated with the lockdown, my screen's still disabled.
Are you, John, are you able to see, if you go down with the cursor, don't you see a share screen button in green?
Here we go, here we go. Can you see that?
Yeah.
See my slides?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I was getting increasingly frustrated with was the kind of political narrative around lockdown that was occurring on social media, and the kind of the othering of our Black and Asian and minority ethnic communities. So I put up a post on the 29th of June, which really was about solidarity more than anything, that what we don't need, the last thing that we needed was this alt-right narrative that the COVID spike was somehow due to migrant communities and that migrant communities were to blame, and that, you know, it's these migrant workers, these individuals who've come here and work in Leicester factories that have caused all the issues. I posted this and didn't think any more about it until I received on Sunday a reply, which was, let's say it's from Mr. X. And it says, can you see this? I suspect very little. Priti Patel will move on to other issues. The left will continue to provide covering fire for the sweatshop owners via status quo rhetoric like this. So what this Mr. X is pointing to is that this idea that there is an established left group in the city and that somehow we're covering up for this problematic working practices, and that it's this new critical right that are all knowing and all powerful. So again, you see this in America, you know, that there is this group of people who claim to know all the answers. Mr. X goes on to point out that I actually blocked him. I mean, the clues in my, you know, I do say that I block racists, so don't bother. I did block this individual, but he goes on to say that you know, I'm ignoring the issue, that I need to, you know, putting my fingers in my ears, all these sweatshops will simply fly away, and that somehow they're in a privileged position knowing what the answers are. And then finally, this other respondent said, indeed, the equalisation nonsense means it's everyone's fault. So this troubled me more than anything, this idea that I put forward that we are stronger together as a community, that we face these challenges together as a community for good or ill. And this respondent's really saying that actually this idea that we're in it equally is wrong. That if we're in it equally, that means we can't blame somebody. We have to have somebody to blame for this. So when we need somebody to blame, if it's not the fault of all of us, then who is it? Well, Mr. X also provides an answer to this. He claimed on his social media that the British are rubbish at racism. If there's one thing the British are rubbish at, it's racism. After Stormzy's dad did a runner, our welfare state helped bring him up. It may not have been perfect, but it was better than was on offer in Ghana. So you have these racist tropes being trotted out, this othering of individuals. So the fact that Storms is, you know, born in Britain is irrelevant. It's his parental heritage that is key, and that it's these people that we have to turn to blame. So this started to become a bit of a key feature in some of the social media posts that I was receiving. So again, here's another example. If we want to blame somebody, we have this narrative that appears where we blame minority communities. So this was a post that went up quite a lot on Facebook, highlighting the positive tests. You can see that the marker pen's been put onto the east of the city, highlighting communities that have higher density ethnic minority populations. And then the comment, the council are racist. They haven't reported the 400 cases in LFE, and that's why we're in lockdown. What this person's saying is they've not reported the 400 white cases. There's no emphasis on the white people that are suffering through lockdown, and that this is a problem, that we're only emphasizing the difficulties that a particular community or communities experience. And then finally, we've touched on this already. You know, I never turn to the Daily Mail for factual information, but this is quite instructive. So this again is a post that you know was doing the rounds at the time of the lockdown, and the commentary that went along with it, I think was really interesting. So again, I should be clear, I'm not denying that sweatshops exist. I'm not denying dark factories, but what I'm worried about is that it's actually the employees of these organisations that are being blamed. So this commenter says, makes everyone so angry reading this, openly flaunted the rules, and we have to suffer. I have to stay at home for at least another 2 weeks because of these bell ends. Guess they can't furlough them as 99% of them don't exist. So let's just think about that statement for a while. So this is an individual who is actually saying that these are non-people, they don't exist, they're undocumented, but it is their fault. It's their fault that this person's going to be inconvenienced for 2 more weeks. They go on to talk about, you know, the lack of police action relating to these organisations. And again, most chillingly of all is this kind of call to action from the right. Time we all got together and did something about it. Well, I agree, we need to do something about it, but not in the tone or manner which is implied here. And then there's another commentator who goes on to, you know, support this individual. So again, I've been really disturbed by the narratives, and this, I know this is mild, but I'm disturbed by the political narratives that have emerged around this, that somehow the left are covering up for, you know, the sins of the factory owners, that now this kind of emergent rights have got the answers, that actually it is the migrant communities that are to blame, that direct action has to be taken by those individuals. And that is a real concern. Now, I'll finish on where I started, and that is, these are problems that are deep-seated in our city. Everybody points to the fact Leicester is a diverse, dynamic, strong, multicultural city. However, the problems with the factories have been there for a long time. I think political parties of all persuasions have dropped the ball on this and have not paid attention to the evidence that exists to resolve it. And I think that's where we really need to start to challenge and move forward. So I've probably run over a little bit.
Thank you, John. If I can ask Edil now, if she's here, to please come in with her contribution, and then we can do a bit of question time before we move to the BLM Leicester panel.
Thank you, Athina, and thanks everyone for having me, for engaging in this really important conversation. This is something that I think is long overdue, and I'm really glad that we're having it. What I wanted to spend my few minutes on talking to you guys about is the way the Somali community in Leicester has been engaging with the BLM movement. And it's something that is quite a bit of a surprise because just to give you some context, the Somali community has moved to Leicester about 20 years ago. And most of them have come from other European countries. So they already had European citizenship before they moved to Leicester. And the main reason most of them came to Leicester is because of the perception that Henrietta had pointed out earlier, that it is a multicultural society, the city is very welcome, it's a very diverse and accepting and tolerant city. And that's something that many of them were lacking in their home towns where they had originally sought refuge in Sweden, Holland, places like Norway. And so Leicester essentially became that safe haven that they can come to and then come together within. And so they formed various neighborhood bubbles, if we can call them that. So you see them predominantly in places like, St. Matthews, in Highfields, Spinney Hill, Evington, and they've been a big part. They've grown to become a big part of Leicester's diversity. Now, over the years, they haven't really been very engaging with Black issues, but what I found really interesting to observe over this COVID period is how they've been able to connect their treatment in hospitals for those that have been affected by COVID, and connecting that to the issues at the heart of the BLM protests. So I've observed a number of things. One is the issue that you guys are all aware of, which is that Black and brown people have been affected by COVID disproportionately, and the Somali community is no different. A lot of them are key workers. They work as nurses, as medical assistants, care workers, taxi drivers. So that has put them at the forefront of being at the receiving end of COVID-19. And then on top of that, in their households, they live intergenerationally. They often live in overcrowded housing. So that also perpetuates the situation. And they culturally are communal people. And so when you put all of those things together, it kind of compounds their susceptibility to the virus. So they've seen a lot of their members, unfortunately dying because of COVID-19. But what I found really interesting was the way that they were frustrated with how these deaths took place. It's the fact that many of them could have been prevented because they weren't seen quick enough. They would go to the hospital and they would be told to go and, take paracetamol, go and stay at home, maybe take a walk. Some of them were told, take baths, take a hot bath, you're feeling a bit cold. I mean, the narrative that was, that I've been listening to have been very, very, very upsetting. And so people would die unnecessarily because they weren't given the tests and the treatment that they needed quick enough. So that frustration sparked a debate to ask themselves, why is it that we are not getting the treatment that we need? And so that's when they started connecting the dots between what the BLM movement is protesting about and the treatment that they are facing. And so I've seen a lot of them, especially the younger generation, actually getting involved with the protest, being on the ground, actively supporting, actively engaging with it. So for me, I see, there's a lot of challenges that have come out of COVID-19, and we are going to be living with this situation for probably a long time to come. But I wanted to look at what the silver linings are. What are the opportunities that are coming out of this situation as well? And one thing that I personally find heartening is how the Somali community now see themselves as part of the larger Black community, because we're all facing the same problems at the hands of what COVID-19 is producing, but also the broader racial issues that they are at the receiving end of. They've been dealing with this for a long time. They're not just dealing with the racial issues and discrimination that they face as Black people, but also as refugees and migrants, and then on top of that, as Muslims, as being visibly Muslim. And so there's a compoundment of marginalization and discrimination that they've already been dealing with. And then on top of that, there's now this the COVID-19 situation that has heightened what they've already been facing. So I wanted to kind of perhaps shed light on that area as a way to kind of give us maybe some optimism, some ways to look at opportunities that are coming out of this. And for me, the real hope is to expand solidarity and engagement across the Black and brown communities, so that we have a larger force that we can pound our fists with, so to speak. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you all very much, and I'm happy to take questions later on.
Thank you, Idil. I learned a lot. I didn't know about this, and I live here in Leicester, but so thank you for this. I would like to call out Will Green, who has a question for John Goodwin at this point.
Hi, thanks Athena, and thanks everyone. I've really enjoyed all of the speeches that everyone's been making. So I'm Will. I'm a professor from the University of Leicester School of Business, and I am from Leicester, and I live in the centre of Leicester. My grandma grew up and lived in Belgrave until she was 105. But my question isn't related to that. So there's lots of things I could talk about. My question is really for you, John. So I have a role within the university around research impact, and as Henrietta and you both said, we have an impact case of one of our colleagues in the business school who has featured in the press recently and a lot over the summer period in relation to the textile industry in Leicester. And he's been working for a lot of groups, including Labour Behind the Label and the Ethical Trading Institute, in relation to some of the regulatory bodies in the textile industry. And you spoke of the evidence base, which I'm not familiar with, going back to the 60s in relation to the textile industry. Yeah. So it's an open question for you, really. Is it the academic community that needs to do more to lobby and to work for our evidence bases to be put into practice? Or is it, I mean, it's a big question. I just wondered if you could speak to that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's, well, I mean, just to go a little bit further, actually, the research on textile work goes back to the 1950s at Leicester. So it started with the employment of married women in a Leicester hosiery factory, which is a study of Coras. Then the young work projects in the 60s and 80s. There's Felstead, Jewson and Goodwin's work on, that's me, home working in the 90s. We've got a long track record of doing this. Are we good at translating those findings into policy? I don't think we are. But the difficulty we have is again, it's a shame Claudia's not here, that when we do engage with politicians on the work, they tend to take the bits out of it that fits their pre-existing narrative. So again, you know, one of the bits of work we did was looking at the transitions of older textiles workers to retirement, and you know, this idea of not being prepared sufficiently for retirement. It was a Labour government at the time basically spun that, and a statement was made in the House of Commons that the older people in Leicester were willing to work much longer beyond retirement age. Well, that's actually not what we'd said. What we'd found was they didn't have the resources to retire, but it had been interpreted in a particular way. So I think we need to get our message across better. I think at the heart of your question actually is, a lot of the time, is who is academic research actually for? And if academics only speak to other academics, it's not really that valuable at all. We need to engage, we need to get our findings out there, and we need to be better at it, notwithstanding, you know, the challenges that we face of how that data and evidence is used.
Thank you, John. I'm aware of time. I don't see another question here. So what I would propose is that we will move on to the activists from the Black Lives Matter movement. If I can call out Cyrus, Brian, if you're here.
Cyrus is currently at work. And
okay.
Tequila, I don't know where she might be here, but I was in that group as well. Who?
Okay. Yes, please.
Sorry, I'll put on the audio. I'm Kenneth Levy. I'm currently a student at the University of Leicester. However, I'm not from Leicester, but the protest that was held on the 6th of June was from myself, Cyrus, Tequila, Huda, and Adam. We're just a few students from university, between University of Leicester and De Montfort. Yeah, don't know really else to say, sorry.
So you were involved also in organizing the protest?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because it is my understanding that because of the COVID safety issues and the protest, you had support from other organizations that were already active in the city. Is that true? You felt that you were supported in organizing, or?
When it came down to it, because we weren't the ones who originally started organizing the protest. It came from a tweet we saw, and I just, from the person who put the tweet up saying they want to do a protest on this day, I, myself and a few others just messaged the person saying help out anywhere we could, and from there we just kind of took over. At the time, we didn't really know that many organizations, but from having that protest, we've been in contact with quite a few
Thank you, Kenneth. Is Tequila Davidson here?
I don't think she is. No.
Olfa, are you here?
Yes, Athina. Yes, Athina, I'm here.
Welcome, Olfa, and I'm very happy you're here as well. Can you tell us, so you are part of the Stop Racism organization, isn't it?
Yes, I'm part of Leicester Stand Up to Racism. We've been approached, we have organized ourselves a small protest, invitation-based, social distancing also, before the big protest of Black Lives Matter. It was few people, and I think you and Ambrose have taken pictures of us when we've done it. But after that, we've been approached by members of Black Lives Matter to help engaging young people, our members, to join them in the big protest. For us, it was a brilliant job. They've done what we've been trying to do since 5 years. We're trying to engage young people. It wasn't easy. This has made the protest very important for our city or for our movement, because it was called by young people. Finally, young people understood that we have a voice. Our voice can be heard. We are stronger together, and we can fight racism. We can stand up to racism. So we had a discussion with them initially about social distancing, because we have some vulnerable people in our members, but then we couldn't fight engaging, and it was a brilliant protest. Earlier, George Cole said that the protest is not everything. It's not everything, of course, sorry, but it is very important, because it is the protest that brought many people together in Leicester. We know that Leicester is multicultural, but we've been trying since 5 years to have people together, to stand up to British First when they came, to come out, to say no to racism many times. People were not really engaging, but this big protest brought people from all age ranges, all colors, everyone was together. This gave us hope. We are not afraid in Leicester. We can fight racism. Obviously, we have to work on that. We are working on that now. We stand up with Black Lives Matter people. We had another protest also against the racism that the journalists faced in Leicester. We worked with Black Lives Matter team, and we had a nice protest then. We said no to racism, and in Leicester we are ready.
I'm glad to hear it. Thank you, Olfa. I would like to ask Wadida Yusuf if they're here.
Hi, yes, I'm here.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Very well.
Okay.
Welcome.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm Wajida. I'm actually the marketing team leader at Leicester College as well. So I work in a local organisation, education establishment. I was part of the team that organised the BLM vigil at Victoria Park that was held on Monday, 2 weeks after the sad murder of George Floyd in America, alongside Tara from Opal Arts, who's going to speak after me. And before I continue, I think, Kenneth, you did a disservice to yourself. Your protest was fantastic. And what you're doing with the Black Bloom on Instagram and raising awareness is amazing work. Don't do yourself a disservice by not mentioning it in these forums.
I was just caught off guard. I wasn't expecting to talk.
Yeah, I think it's important that you highlight that. So I just wanted to sort of highlight the great work that I've seen them doing as well while I've got the opportunity. I felt the need to do something and stand up against the injustices and become an ally for the Black community. After sitting with Tara and discovering some of my family history, where my granddad was fighting for equality and calling for an end to racism in the 50s and 60s, one of the things he did was write an end to racism memorandum that went out to politicians and the Commonwealth. And I was devastated that 50 years later, I was sat having the same conversations still. And I thought it was important to sort of honor his legacy somewhat and take part in fighting for the justice that is required for these situations and what is occurring and the systemic racism within society. So I'm going to touch a little bit about the sort of the BLM side of things, as well as what followed in terms of the Leicester lockdown as well, because then there was some work that I sort of looked at as part of racism and what happened with the local Leicester lockdown. During this time and then the weeks to follow after what happened with the Black Lives Matter movement and what is happening with the Black Lives Matter movement, it left me incredibly anxious and sad to see the racist voice that John's highlighted as well become louder and louder online, and in some instances in person as well. And ultimately, it started to affect the mental health of myself and people around me. I grew up in Highfields, in the heart of the area that was sort of being blamed. I was surrounded by test centres, and I'm right up the road from Spinney Hill Park where there was a base. And the media frenzy was surrounding where I live. After the announcement that some areas in Leicester and Leicestershire would be the first to go into lockdown, the media spotlight was firmly on us for those weeks and weeks to come. There were rumours and relentless racial bias that was plastered across front pages of newspapers, homepages of online news websites, which resulted in the opening of floodgates for many racist comments across comment sections in both local, national, and international press. It was a stark contrast from us winning the Premiership, and we were suddenly being known for something very different around the world. One of which actually went as far as saying some areas of Leicester needed to be ethnically cleansed. There were some further comments. I assume that this spike occurring 4 weeks after Eid and 2 weeks after the BLM protests is purely coincidental. The reason why Leicester has gone into lockdown again is because the Asian and the BAME population will not socially distance and probably don't wash their hands. They have turned Leicester and every other British city where large numbers live into toilets. These are just some of the comments that I'm reading, and probably some of the more tame ones, to be honest with you. One of the key areas I felt needed tackling as part of this was hate crime, especially online, and the responsibility of media, press, and social media outlets in how they report things or allow things to be presented on their platforms. But also one of the key questions that I had was, surely the local police and local organizations that are around to protect us, why had they not made their stance clear with a public statement to say that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated in our city, and put out a public statement to make us feel safe? Because by showing us this public display of solidarity, the organization that is out to protect us, it was necessary for them to actually come out and say that there'll be no tolerance or zero tolerance on this. This was also part of discussions that myself and other BLM protest organizers had with the Chief of Police and the PCC office as well. And there were some further discussions about hate crime around that as well. With this happening and playing out both online and on news channels, not just here and internationally, I started to compile a digital folder of research that highlighted the scale of how this narrative was playing out online. I turned this into a report with recommendations of how changes can be made in order to better police this kind of behavior online and encourage outlets to have some accountability for their content. I have shared it with Athina, and I'm happy to share it with everyone else in the group too. Just one of the key examples that I pulled out was the knife attack in Reading. When this was initially reported on Sky News and many other news outlets with the headline, "Police Dealing with Serious Incident After Black Lives Matter Protest." The protest had taken place somewhat 2 hours before, but at this stage, the link had been made and it was tweeted and retweeted and liked approximately 1,600 times and approximately 1,300 likes. As more details emerged, the headline was then updated, changed to say, "Police Dealing with Serious Incident at Park in Reading," thus removing the Black Lives Matter protest reference on the same page under the same URL. This was then retweeted 188 times and liked 206, over 750% less engagement compared to the original tweet. So damage was already done. These tweets have since been removed and all trace of this is no longer available, but the damage caused initially was significant. So what did Sky News and other news outlets do to ensure that this is rectified, and those somewhat 1,600 people approximately were provided the details of the update and the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement and the protest had nothing to do with this incident. This kind of reporting causes hate and even leads to someone being harmed further, such as in the case, a whole group of people actually being blamed. And actually they were standing up for justice for against this very discrimination that they were facing in the media at the time. In fact, if you go to the URL and link for this article, in the actual URL, the headline still says "Police Dealing with Serious Incident After Black Lives Matter," even though the article now underneath it has no reference to it, bar a little paragraph at the end to say it had nothing to do with it. This type of unregulated use of social media is starting to now shape the way society is thinking, and thus not actually helping to remove racism, the discriminatory narrative, but fueling it. I know that in terms of errors are inevitable, but the lack of transparency, I don't think that's forgivable. One of my main concerns has been that while traditional print journalism TV has had years of scrutiny and key legislation placed on how data is used, what is distributed and what people can say, the same level of integrity and legislation does not suddenly apply when it moves to online and in particular social media. If this continues and something is not put in place soon, the thought of what this could lead to from a socio-economic perspective could be devastating for future generations. This lack of scrutiny is feeding into a racist agenda, including other situations such as politics, voting, celebrity culture, product placement, and the selling and buying of personal data. The lack of clear rules and regulations is extremely worrying and scary. This was highlighted most recently on the Netflix documentary called The Social Dilemma, I believe it's just come out in the last 2 weeks, which had the actual creators and architects and presidents of some of the most well-known social and internet platforms highlight the concern about what they call the beast online and what it's becoming. And if people like us do not stand up for the very thing they created, for it to change, it could lead to a dystopian society. And that is a bold claim from the inventors, and extremely worrying for people like us if we're not recognizing the impact when those people that created it are concerned themselves. Just yesterday, some celebrities who are known for their social...
Because I know that you can, definitely I'm very interested. I need to talk to you separately as well at some point, because you do have a lot to say. But in the interest of including other people, shall we sort of stop you there for now, because there are questions for you and other people in this activist panel, and take some thoughts from Tara now. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, that's sure.
Just a way for like kind of having some kind of symmetrical situation. Is Tara here?
Yeah. I'm here. Can you hear me?
Really well.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, so I was part of putting the video together with Wajida on the Monday, and it was something that Wajida came to me and asked if I would be involved in, because my organisation, the organisation I run, we deal with Black heritage within the arts and heritage side of things, but looking at Black excellence. Sorry, I've just realised my TV. I do apologise for a second. Let me turn that on mute. Yeah, and since then, it's been kind of a bit of a whirlwind, because initially when we we finished the vigil, we were approached by the Police and Crime Commissioner to come in and have a meeting, which I got together with the other members from the Leicester Against Racism and Kenneth's group as well, the Black Boom, because I felt that rather than us all being picked off as individuals, it would be better if we could go in there collectively. So we arranged to have a meeting with the Police and Crime Commissioners to talk about the way that they interact with the Black community and see if we could kind of make any headway with what they had been doing over the past few years. What we found was a collection of people that didn't actually want to listen to us. And I think that's what is being shown at the moment, where organisations, as in the council, as in the police force, as in some sides of the medical side, they have to tick a box to say that they are speaking to the Black community. And they're very good at ticking those boxes. So we are asked into meetings to talk, but they're not listening. So how do things change if they're not willing to listen? And, you know, one thing that I constantly say is the issues that we have within the Black community or with racism towards the Black community is not something that we as a community can change. This has to come from the wider public. This has to come from the government, police, and all of those organisations, because that's the root of the racism. Black people are affected by racism, but they are not. They're not the aggressors of it. So we really need to look at changing the ways that we feel about these things. When, you know, every time there is an issue with the Black community, a member or somebody within our community is asked to come and see what we can do about it. Like it's our problem. What can we do to change this? But we can't change it. It has to come from them, and they should be coming to us and saying, okay, we've done the reports, we've got all the information, we hear what you're saying, we've heard what you're saying, this is what we've done, this is what we've achieved, now what more can we do? I'm not hearing that at the moment. And last week I gave a workshop with Leicestershire County Council. I did the morning of Black British History, and I did the evening of in the afternoon of how to challenge racism. Within that, these were all educated people. They are very liberal people, very like-minded people, interested in how they could help in whatever ways. But 4 of them started crying because they had no idea of the facts that happen within this country relating to Black people. And that is a problem. That really is a problem. If people don't even have an idea of the issues that affect Black people in this country, how do we move forward? It shouldn't be something new. It should be something that we all know about by now. And that's it from me. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Tara. Fantastic. Can I ask for Brian to contribute here, if he's here? Brian?
I actually think, I know Brian said that he needed to go off. He was in here earlier.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Perhaps Lara, is Lara here now? Lara or Stefan, will we have any? We have these people here. Okay, so why don't we see whether we can get them on later. There are a few questions. I would like to ask Gavin Brown to actually ask his question first to Kenneth.
Okay, so hi Kenneth. Hello. The question is slightly inspired by a bit of insider knowledge, having been on the WhatsApp group for the stewarding team and stewarding alongside Wahida and Tara on the day. But I mean, I know there was this really interesting collaboration between kind of your collective and some of the young people from Climate Strike, from Leicester Climate Strike. I'd just like to hear a little bit about how that developed and kind of why you felt they were useful allies to turn to for practical advice.
Well, to be honest, I think how it first started, because me, Cyrus, and a few others said that we needed stewards on a day to, you know, maintain social distancing and things like that. And we had, it was more the fact that they approached us and said, we're part of this activist group and we want to help out as any way we can. It wasn't as if we're directly asking like other activist groups to come help us. They more approached us, and a lot of the members there helped out a lot with our protest. So that's kind of how the relationship started with that, really. It wasn't, you know, us directly going to that activist group. You're on mute, yeah.
Okay, thank you. There is a question from the Facebook live feed here that I would like to relay. Just forgive me a minute. It was actually to ask you, Kenneth, but I suppose the other contributors, but it's for you especially, whether you were involved in activism before this, and how, have you involved basically before? Do you think that you and other students are going to be continue to be engaged in activism? This is the question. I think it's a good question. So please.
I haven't been involved in activism like this at all before. It was more the fact that during that time because this was early in the pandemic, and on social media, especially seeing on Twitter, obviously the tragic news about George Floyd, as well as other racist incidents that were happening all over the world. And I think what sparked this protest as well, especially for me, was that I saw so many cities around in Europe. I was seeing protests happening in France, Germany, but I was seeing protests happening in the UK, the Birmingham one that happened at a similar time. And it was more the fact, I was just seeing this, I was getting motivated, and I was thinking to myself, I want to be a part of this, I want to do something, you know, for my race. And from there, I saw the tweet about someone wanted to hold a protest in Leicester. So I was like to myself, you know, I want to make sure this happens. And I kind of took upon myself, as well as the other members, to make sure that it did happen. Regarding the future, with the Black Bloom, we are still working. I've been in contact with other activist groups against racism, and I do feel that I will be continuing partake. You know what I mean? Like, I will continue being an activist, if that answers the question.
Excellent to hear. There is a question from Carol Laming here about what is the people's reaction to Leicester City Council appointment of an assistant mayor for Black Lives Matter. I don't know if, Carol, you want to ask this question, because I'm not sure I understand it, but maybe other people do in this panel and they can tell us about it. Otherwise, if I can call you out to ask it.
Yes, that's fine. I'm quite happy to do that. Okay. Some weeks ago, after the Black Lives Matter activism and activity and protests, I did sit in on a Zoom meeting of Leicester City Council, where Peter Soulsby, the city mayor, announced that Sue Hunter would be an assistant mayor with the title of an assistant mayor for Black Lives Matter. That was in a formal council meeting, minuted, etc. So I just wondered what people thought about that, because I haven't done the research, but I suspect she's probably the only councillor in a local authority with that title and portfolio. And she has had, I think, one Zoom meeting, community meeting so far. But I just wondered what people's reaction to that was.
Does anyone have a reaction, is the question here, that wants to say something about this? Because we're entering the microphysics of power of the Leicester City Council here, which I'm not sure I know anything about. Does anyone have something to say about this? Or 1, 2, 3. I'm sorry, Carol. I'm gonna. There is. Ambrose has something to say. Welcome, Ambrose. Thank you for saving me here.
Okay.
Yet again.
All right. So I think Councillor Suanta's appointment is a good thing. Why it is a good thing is because Leicester City Council is notorious for marginalizing, especially the city's Black community. For example, I'll give you the statistics that I posted earlier, which say that according to the 2011 census, Leicester is 50.5% white, 37% Asian, 6% Black, 3.5% mixed, and 2.6% other. But if you look at Leicester City Council's employment practices itself, these demographics, these statistics are not reflected in who Leicester City Council employs. If you look at the power structure of the City Council, you find that it is exclusively, or before Councillor Hunter's appointment, it was exclusively a white and Asian affair. In other words, for someone like me looking at this, I would say Leicester City Council is a colonial city. Look at who the city gives apprenticeships to. You will find that young black men especially are marginalized. You don't see them in who the City Council gives apprenticeships to. So look at senior management. It's predominantly white and South Asian. Where is everyone else? So I think Leicester as a city, we celebrate the diversity like what I've been hearing in this platform. But in real terms, in practical terms, the city is institutionally and structurally racist. So maybe with Councillor Hunter's appointment, things will change. That is my intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you. May I call out Bharti Acharya to ask to make a comment, and the comment you had and to me privately, I've asked you if it's okay to make it in public. Would you like to do this now?
Yes, that is fine. If you can't see me, this is hopefully you can see me now. Okay. Obviously, I have come across quite a few BLM meetings, forums, and a lot of media work. And I think from the groups that are sort of around in authorities like the Leicestershire County Council or City Council, a lot of people still seem to think that Black donates or denotes to just Africans and Caribbeans. Tell you the truth, really, I think anybody of color has faced a lot of racism, a lot of discrimination. And I think we need to be a bit mindful about people of color of all sorts, because it is there, the racism is out there, subtly, whatever. And data actually within the councils and other authorities actually prove it, that as Ambrose says, the senior positions are very, very rarely occupied or given to anybody of color, anyone of color. And so when you talk about BLM, I understand absolutely where it's come from, but if we're going to make that change, it needs to incorporate all people of color. It needs to represent, and it is a perfect platform, as you said, that this is a time to unite, and all of us need to unite and give one forefront voice message, because we are all facing that discrimination and racism.
Thank you very much for that intervention. Is there, I don't know if there are other questions, because my suggestion would be perhaps if they're not at this point, to have a little bit of a break and restart at 6 o'clock. I think we could use with a bit of a break and restart, where we're going to have colleagues from the University of Leicester and others more the academic reaction perhaps to what was happening here. If we can go for a break and come back at 6 o'clock with a view to start at 6:05, that would be great. I hope that's okay. Okay, so yeah, so I'm just gonna go off camera, and we'll be back around 6 o'clock. Thank you very much, if that's okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, Amanda. Yeah, they've took a break. They're going to be back on in about, I think about half an hour. So I think most.
We're gonna be back at 6.
Oh, sorry, you're going to be back at 6.
6, yeah, so maybe I'm just saying, so we don't, who is here, we don't get confused. I would like to get back at 6 so we can start at 6, a little bit after 6, if that's okay. But thank you, Tara, for like doing the hosting duties here. That's very nice.
That's okay. Thank you for inviting me.
Sorry, I was on mute. You'd think I'd be used to this by now.
How are you?
It's been interesting, has it?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I think we will slowly start again our discussion, slowly and steadily, like all things that we do here in England, slow and steady. Not so successfully recently. Gavin knows what I'm talking about there. He's secretly laughing, secretly. Okay. So I was actually asking Sharon, I don't know if she's actually here at the moment.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Sharon. Yes, I messaged you, but probably you didn't sort of see me there. I was wondering if we can slowly start the discussion. I know that you have, that your PhD research was on the Black Lives Matter, the previous incarnations, that is the previous cycles. And I wanted very much to hear from you about this research so we can kickstart this discussion with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. And hi, everyone. It's been really interesting to listen to the discussions. I've got to apologize if you hear a baby in the background. I do have a 4-month-old baby and she's managed to sleep through most of the talk. And then as soon as it's my go to speak, she wakes up. They just have the perfect timing, don't they? So yeah, please do excuse me if you do hear that noise in the background, but if you can't hear me, please do let me know. But yes, thank you so much, Athina, for inviting me to speak today, and to Zakia for connecting us. It's been very nice to sort of hear everyone speak and having this space to connect and sort of think about how we move forward. And these spaces are really useful, as it's really important to talk and have this dialogue and, you know, see where different people are coming from and connect on various issues. So yes, as Athina said, I am a PhD research student at the moment, but I'm also a community activist and a community organizer as well. And I'm not actually based in Leicester and I'm not from Leicester. I went to the University of Leicester to do my undergraduate, and I also studied my master's there. So I feel like a big part of my heart is in Leicester, as I spent a lot of my formative years there. I'm actually doing my PhD at De Montfort University, but I am based in Leeds, West Yorkshire. So yeah, I am still very much connected to Leicester. I taught there prior to getting pregnant and being in lockdown. So I visit Leicester a lot, so I'm very familiar with the communities and some of the issues that have been spoken about here today. So firstly, I think there's two angles I'm coming from, being in academia, but also being an activist. So firstly, I'll start by reflecting on some of what my PhD research has found and how it connects to some of the issues that we've witnessed with the protest and in lockdown and the pandemic. So my research is actually looking at how Black millennials experience criminalisation and how they resist it. And in talking about experiencing criminalisation, I'm really interested in finding out how Black millennials observe their own criminalisation. So what are some of the experiences that have happened throughout their life histories that has made them feel criminalised? It's very much coming from using the critical race theory tenet of giving voice to the voiceless and sharing the stories and the narratives of marginalised people. And often Black millennials, and you know, the term millennials has been seen as being such a negative term and have negative connotations. We're told we're lazy, we're entitled, we're selfish, and you know, every other negative thing in the book. So that has been quite problematic, especially for Black millennials who have the added barrier of oppression that they face with racism, misogyny, sexism, ableism, and so forth. So what I really wanted to do is sort of turn this negative narrative on its head and give Black millennials the voice to voice some of their experiences with criminalisation, but also talk about how they're resisting it. I think it's important when we talk about issues of oppression and when we talk about some of the issues we experience, we think about the solutions as well. And we think about what are people doing, what have people done, and sort of look back to what's being done and what's happening within the communities. There are a lot of knowledge and experiential knowledge in the communities, especially with Black young people, that often gets missed out. And as we can see with the recent protests that happened following the murder of George Floyd, and a lot of people who have spoken before me have mentioned the power that the youth have brought when we're thinking about resistant efforts. With the Black Lives Matter effort that happened, I know Kenneth was speaking earlier, a lot of the people who are seen in this organising and mobilising capacities have been Black millennials and Black young people. So what are some of their experiences and how do they face those criminalisation? I'm currently coming towards the end of my data collection, and it has been quite ironic that a lot of my data collection has taken place during this time of protest, because one of the things that I found is that a lot of Black millennials have wanted to speak on these issues and have wanted to talk about these issues for several years, but have felt sort of shut out of conversations, because often when we think about activism and organising and even politics, we think about that as being for the older generation and being for a different time. Often when we think about racism, and we've seen in our media, we keep hearing this word, the Windrush generation, and it's almost that the conversation, the narrative forgets that racism didn't start or stop there. There's a whole history of colonialism. There's a whole legacies of colonialism that people and generations of Black and brown people are still experiencing, and Black millennials being one of those who are at the forefront currently. So with the whole protest, one of the things that emerged, speaking to my participants, has been the power of these digital spaces that we now find ourselves in. You know, we're all here in a Zoom room that has allowed us to connect. Whilst we're all in Leicester and through lockdown, we're able to connect in these online virtual spaces. And this has also been something that has been utilised by Black millennials prior to lockdown. We all know the mobilising capacity digital platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram have had. And now in this period of lockdown, we're starting to see that a lot of the organising and activism has moved to these platforms. There has been a lot of theories and, you know, theorising and conceptualising that has tried to make Twitter activists or, you know, Slacktivists seem like they're redundant and like their resistance efforts are also not, you know, part of the narrative of activism. As we're now seeing with these digital spaces, Black and brown people are utilising these spaces. But in thinking about these digital spaces, one of the other things that we also need to think about is who has access to these spaces, who are able to get online and come into Zoom rooms, who are the people who are able to be here. And all of us here are privileged to have those access. Some of the communities that I work with and some of the participants that I spoke with aren't always able to access these spaces. So it's thinking about, now that we've managed to build something with these digital spaces, how do we enable everyone to benefit from them, especially when we think about some of the discussions that we've had surrounding COVID and the pandemic and some of the conversations we've had surrounding the protests. How do we make sure that everyone is included and the voices of everyone are heard? So again, thinking towards solutions is important that we ask these questions and think about these questions. And from a research point of view, although my research initially did not have or did not envision that there would be a pandemic and a lockdown and protests within this lockdown, one of the things that I see for the outcome of my research is to have some, you know, answers and to have some possible solutions about how we move forward with issues of resistance, activism and digital spaces in this post-COVID or post-lockdown time. But also from a activist perspective, I work with a lot of migrant communities up here in Leeds. I work with an organisation called the Racial Justice Network, and since prior to lockdown, we were involved with communities, speaking to communities that felt marginalised, and getting involved in things like a knowledge exchange, and, you know, finding out what are some of the concerns that they had and some of the things that we could help mobilise them so they could go out and actually, you know, get some of their rights. And our director has done a lot of work prior to the protest, but one of the things we found from the protest is that a lot of people have come to us from these migrant communities saying what some of the experiences that they've had, especially under the hostile environment. So another point that I would like to also have us reflect on in this space is how the hostile environment is impacting those migrant communities and what we can actually do from our own, you know,
even at homes or in these spaces, to make sure that those communities that are marginalized, that won't have access to these conversations, how do we take these conversations back to them? But also, how do we include them in the conversations? Because a lot of the answers that we're looking for are there. I know Tara spoke earlier on about, you know, people seeking to always come to these communities and taking from our communities and saying, oh yeah, we found this, we found out this knowledge, but not giving back to those communities. So how can we ensure that there is, you know, an inclusion that doesn't sort of try to always be extractive from those communities, but also listen to them and make sure that they're being heard. We are currently working on a campaign called the Stop the Scan campaign, which people might not have heard about, but knowing that how diverse Leicester is potentially something that might impact the community there. But the police at the moment are currently using biometric fingerprint devices in order to essentially find people, to scan people who are stopped and for any reason at the actual time and place, rather than taking them to the station. And we're arguing that these scanners are also linked to the Home Office database, so it can actually cause fear within those communities. During COVID and lockdown, these devices were also they also had a COVID penalty functions added to them. And a lot of the people who were experiencing some of the penalties from these sort of devices were from these communities that have been marginalized and affected by the hostile environment. So we're asking questions about how much are we letting our government and the state do under this umbrella and this banner of the hostile environment? And is it possible to maintain a hostile environment when a lot of the dialogue during the lockdown period and during the pandemic was about keeping people safe, making sure that we all take care of each other and, you know, looked out for one another? But who are those communities not being looked after, and how do we sort of hold the state accountable to some of the things that they're doing on these digital spaces, the use of people's information and data without knowing that their data is being used? What are some of the things that we can, you know, do to sort of address those issues? So yeah, I feel like I've spoken about a lot, but yeah.
Yes, I was about to say that it's gonna look like I liked you more, which is probably true now that I've let you talk a little bit more than everybody else. So there you go, there you have it. Chair's privilege. I need to check it though. The next person that I want to ask to contribute here is Jackie. Jackie, Jackie Sanchez-Taylor, are you here now? I hope you are.
I am here. Hello.
How are you? Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. And we've had some fantastic speakers. Thank you for inviting me, Athina. I wanted to talk about the idea of interruption, just because there's not much you can say in a 5-minute slot. And COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement has really interrupted us and made us see racial violence and the persisting and enduring racism that lots of people experience all the time. And it's also made people brave enough to speak out as a collective rather than just as an individual, and made people listen. And I think that's important. So I wanted to focus on the idea of interruptions and the two major interruptions, and how they've made us focus on global racial inequalities, anti-Blackness, discrimination, and continuing state violence. And that this is actually linked into a long-standing legacy around slavery and colonialism, which is actually a continuing feature of modernity and liberal states. It's not something that went away and then suddenly we became modern, but actually racism has continued throughout. If you think about, you know, we sort of think of the liberalism as being something new that was a separation with a sort of feudal state. But actually one of the continuing features of modernity has been racism and sexism as well. So this interruption has really blown apart the idea that we live in a post-racial and egalitarian society. And it's also shown how whiteness continues to structure power relations of inequality. And this is one thing that keeps on surprising me during these last few months, is the extent that whiteness has been free from racial interruptions, which is what this really is. You know, interruptions are kind of differentiated by power relations. So the type of interactions and when someone's interrupted is different for everyone. So those precarious workers in the garment factories or the Uber driver will experience this interruption very differently from a white professor in a university or a banker in the city, or indeed me. So usually Black and brown people don't have the power to disrupt the conversation. They don't usually have the power to interrupt what's going on. They're the ones that are continually interrupted by questions about their legitimacy and their belonging. They have, you know, they have their privilege questioned and their sense of self challenged with the "where are you from" question all the time. And I think that this is kind of one of the things that has really started to make white people think about their own racialized identity and processes of racism, so that they also have a sense of themselves as how other people see them. And so we're all kind of reflecting on processes of racialization in a different way to gain a deeper understanding of it. But I think there's also kind of quite a lot of resistance to this process. So I think it's really important as well to think about, you know, one of the things I'm worried about is that interruptions are usually very temporal things. You know, they don't last very long. They don't give you, you know, they just give you enough time to sort of think about how you could reorganize the world in another way. But I'm worried about what happens when we go back to normal, what happens when there is some sort of normality. How do we keep these conversations going? How do we keep the force of this going? So I don't want to kind of return to a normality, really. I kind of want that to really shift. I don't want it to go to a normality in my community or in my work. And I'm a little bit worried about how, you know, we can be silenced. Hall talks about how interruptions can create theoretical work because, you know, it kind of allows you to reorganize your ideas. And so this is a real moment, I think, that we need to kind of, in universities in particular, is to think about how we can have a more inclusive dialogue and interaction with each other, with activists like you're doing now, and bring those voices in to develop a kind of real, you know, different way of sort of thinking about theory and how we go forward in order to kind of keep this momentum going. So that's really what I wanted to say.
Jackie, that was
very short, sorry.
Wonderful as always. Thank you very much. I'm gonna ask Gavin Brown now to contribute, and we're gonna do a round of questions at 6:25, hopefully. But Gavin.
Okay, thank you, Athina, and thanks to Sharon and Jackie for what's just come before. I'm not quite sure how to follow that. One of the things that I've been thinking about is citizenship in relation to everything that's been going on, and trying to use the framework of citizenship and the limits of citizenship to try and link together some of these different moments from the last few months. Before I do that, though, I kind of want to follow up the previous panel, and just to say that you know, for somebody who's participated in and helped organise a lot of protests over the last 30+ years, it was an absolute pleasure to be part of the stewarding team at the BLM protest in Leicester, and to take a step back and be led by a younger generation of Black activists. After 13 years in Leicester, seeing the small number of the same old, increasingly aging faces organising protests there, it was a real difference, both in feel and in personnel. And I hope that intergenerational learning in both directions across generations continues out of it. But I want to come to this thought of citizenship, and to think about moments of pandemic citizenship, because I think in some ways the public health guidelines that we're all expected to follow, confusing as they may be, contradictory as they may be, impel us to acts of citizenship, to be good citizens. And like any form of citizenship, there's a dividing line that's set up between those of us who are imagined to be good citizens in that moment and bad citizens. The good citizen in the midst of this pandemic is imagined to be someone who complies with public health regulations in order to protect others and to protect the public good and the nation. Conversely, bad pandemic citizens are those who are deemed to be selfish or not, or taking risks that put others at risk to undo that, refuse to comply in various ways. And we can, you know, lots of speakers have already spoken about how, you know, generally, but also specifically in Leicester, that's become racialised in various ways. But I also want to make the argument that that pandemic citizenship gets caught up with all of the other political and geopolitical events and conflicts of the moment. And that some of those tensions get mapped in different ways across the world onto reveal the fault lines within citizenship in any given nation state. And I think, you know, in many ways that's one of the reasons why the BLM movement kicked off in the US after George Floyd's murder, and why there was why it had resonance internationally. That kind of linking of the necropolitics of the pandemic with the broader systemic racism in US, British and other societies. And I think you can also think about the ways in which in a UK context, while that's happening, the kind of imperative of pandemic citizenship also gets caught up with all of the contradictions and unresolved issues around Brexit, and the xenophobia that goes with that, and the suspicion of experts that was mobilised around the Brexit referendum. So I think we can see that in the sort of public health realm, but we can also think of moments like the BLM protest as forms of insurgent citizenship that come from below, that offer alternatives, that force a wedge through those fault lines within society. And I think lots has been said so far today about Black Lives Matter, and I don't want to really say any more about that, but I want to pick up on something that another aspect of the last few months in Leicester and elsewhere that hasn't been touched on yet. And that's the kind of the use of social media to build local neighbourhood mutual aid networks. And I think that's part of the story that we could perhaps tease out a little bit more in the discussion, because I think the way in which that network in Leicester started with a conversation between about 20 people who kind of knew each other through existing activist and community networks, and then within a week kind of spiraled to a network of more than 2,000 people on Facebook groups and WhatsApp groups, I think is an interesting thing. I don't have enough of a sense of how that played out in different areas of the city, but I think but what I have seen is that it had very localized inflections reflecting the kind of patchwork of communities across the city. And I think thinking about the strengths and weaknesses of that network is something really useful for us to continue to engage in conversation.
Totally, I agree totally, and we will definitely pick this one up in the discussion because it's a part also of my research interest. So very happy you brought it up. I would like now to call on Raul Castorcia, if you are here now to.
I'm here, Athina.
Thank you. Okay.
No, thank you for the invitation. I'll start with a disclaimer. I'm not from Leicester. I work at the University of Leicester, but I'm not even from the UK. I am originally from Romania, and I am of part Roma origin. And you might have heard of the Roma minority, which is one of Europe's most discriminated against minorities. There are not a large number of Roma in the UK, and they're mostly known as travelers in the UK. But the Roma minority spread mostly in states in Eastern Europe, although it's also present in Western Europe. Long story short, I wasn't in Leicester during the pandemic. I wasn't in Leicester for the lockdown or for the protests, but I was in Germany at the time, and there were BLM protests in Germany, as Kenneth mentioned earlier. But I was working during the pandemic on a project addressing the impact of COVID-19 on the Roma minority. And I think some of the experience of the Roma is very much similar to what we heard earlier about the experience of Black and minority ethnic communities in the UK. They also, as a community, also has an experience of slavery of over 500 years in numerous countries in Europe. They are experiencing poor living conditions and endemic poverty. Just to give you an example, the average life expectancy in the EU is 85 years. In Romania, that's 75. The Roma in Romania have 65 years as an average life expectancy. So you can see just from this one indicator the huge difference between the majority population and this community in Eastern Europe. Now, they were disproportionately affected by the pandemic in 5 ways that my project looked at: access to healthcare, which was limited before the pandemic, but got worse in the context of many health services restricting access; poor housing conditions, including access to clean water and proper sanitation; earning a living, because most Roma work in the informal economy or are employed as day laborers; access to education. Again, poverty means drastic inequality when it comes to accessing online education for Roma children. There was also a disproportionate impact on Roma women, also both in terms of employment and in terms of domestic violence, which was increasing during the lockdowns. These structural elements, combined with outright cases of racism, there was a spike in hate speech and hate crime against the Roma in all the 7 countries that my project looked at. There were public perceptions of Roma as spreaders of disease, pretty much following up on long-standing associations of Roma with poor hygiene, again associated with poor housing conditions. The Roma communities were singled out for military quarantine in many of these countries, although there were no health reasons for placing certain communities in quarantine. Just by virtue of them being Roma, they were basically locked down by the military rather than the police. And there were several cases of disproportionate use of force by the police in targeting Roma communities. So what does this have to do with the topic of today's seminar? And I think it brings me back to what Jackie was saying earlier about global racial inequalities, and these go beyond the color line, or at least beyond the color line as we sometimes imagine it in Western Europe, and that certain communities have received even less attention despite their structural discrimination. To give you an example, there were BLM protests in my home country, Romania, but none of them linked up to the racism against the Roma, although the racism against the Roma was going on at the same time was being happening. And for all extensive purposes, the Black community in Romania is the Roma community. That's how they are perceived by the majority population. There is also a slight difference in skin color. It's not always the case, but the point being that despite the mobilization for BLM, this did not link up to local racisms. And yes, I agree with Jackie that whiteness continues to structure power relations and inequality. And when I look at this in my research, I tend to see it not just in terms of race, but also as an intersection of race and class, where the two, of course, reinforce each other. And I guess that's what I had to say.
Thank you, Raul, for this contribution. I think now we're gonna open the Zoom floor room, whatever it's called these days, for questions. If there are any, I'm just looking here. So I don't have anything actually right now, from what I can see. In which case,
I think John was waving.
Sorry, because I didn't see it on the chat, so I couldn't see it. So John, please go ahead.
No, just an observation, really. Thank you, Raoul, for your presentation. That was really interesting and really powerful. And it just, we had another event a few months ago where we talked about this intersection of notions of cleanliness and ethnicity that's emerged around COVID. So there's the there's the advertising for Lifebuoy soap, and the advert is actually a group of black children around a water pipe. And so there's a very clear association between dirt, germs, and particular communities. And it came up earlier as well in the conversation about comments on social media about communities being dirty, spreading disease, and so on. So I just thought it's just an observation. It seems to be one of those ideas that permeates through a lot of the discussions around COVID in particular. But anyway, thank you for your contribution. It was really, really interesting.
I can also, if you want me to respond to that.
Yes,
well, thank you for that comment, John. That's really good to hear. The association of, this association of cleanliness and hygiene is long running, like I said, in anti-Roma racism. So it's a general perception of Roma as not having hygiene standards comparable to those of the majority. Of course, this gets much worse in the context of a pandemic where the medical advice is to wash often. So in the course of my research, I came across a lot of examples of for example, racist memes about the Roma having to wash now, and this sort of like going against their culture and so on. But I think it's also what I found. It's very much a matryoshka of racisms, if you want, because in Germany, where I am now, Romanians and Bulgarians were accused of bringing the disease because they do the dirty work, as Jacqueline was saying. They work in meat factories, for example, which were COVID, which were loci of outbreaks in Germany. So some of the local politicians have claimed that this disease was imported from Eastern Europe by migrants coming over to work, doing this kind of low-paid jobs comparable to the garment factories that were brought up in the first part of this event. And that from those, of course, the disease spread into the wider community. And obviously, like I said, this is, on the one hand, you have Romanians, for example, in Germany or elsewhere being associated with the dangerous, dirty migrants. And in Romania itself, you have another community which is seen as being on a lower status level than the majority community, which is being blamed for much the same.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. So again, the parallel is that the workers in the factory in Leicestershire, they're blamed for COVID because of personal failings around cleanliness and an inability to control themselves. And it's a really powerful narrative that people seize upon because they want to blame.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Can we get back? I don't know if anyone has, because I can't see very well. I do have a comment actually from Olfa here, if you want to make it. I always hear the voice of somebody that is in France somehow. Olfa, are you here? You want to make your
comment? I can hear you now.
Okay.
Yes, I've been going around with some friends. Actually, in France, they don't really respect COVID and the social distance. And I was shocked. Everybody's hugging everybody is close to each other. It's different to UK. I was shocked first days. I've been here for almost 1 month, but I've been hearing that comments from people that Arabs bring they spread like the Asian community in Leicester, for example, because they tend to gather to meet each other, bigger families. So they are blamed for spreading the COVID. Immigrants, especially the illegal ones, and they are also blamed because of cleanness. They are not clean. They don't have access to water, for soap, stuff like that. So I've been a bit outraged, feeling outrageous. I need some protest here, but no one to organize with me, obviously. I was shocked by the French, the people, and it is always by the settled immigrants, because South France, as we know, partly they are from Italian origin or from Spain. So it is a mixture themselves. They are settled here some generations, but now they are blaming the new immigrants. It happens everywhere, and it is the case here. I'm leaving tomorrow, hopefully, so no need to protest here.
Thank you, Olga, for that intervention.
Can I just jump in a second? I think there's a really interesting point that we've kind of perhaps paid a little bit too much attention to the exchange of ideas between North America and the UK, both in terms of inspiring BLM protests, but also kind of inspiring sort of alt-right narratives that John was analysing earlier and that several of us have referred to. But I think we need to recognise that in a city that has the diversity that Leicester has, you've got all sorts of ideas circulating from around the world. That it's not just a kind of alt-right dialogue coming from the US, but I think we might also think about how, you know, extreme Hindu nationalism ideas are flowing in from India, as well as kind of like the rhetoric from Poland and elsewhere. And I think it particularly around the sort of the traction of Hindutva politics in parts of Leicester's Indian diaspora, I think that draws attention to the replication not just of racism but of casteism within the city. And I think that's something that we're perhaps not paying enough attention to, which kind of draws on Jackie's point about minorities doing the dirty work. There's a politics of untouchability going on in the city that we need to pay attention to, and challenge as well.
I wonder, because previously I admitted Brian in. Brian, are you here now? Is it possible that you want to share your thoughts? I don't know if I'm calling you and you don't want to be called.
No, that's fine. I had a meeting to put away with that kind of stuff. No, I think you think it's right in terms of the discussion, is people to have a broader understanding of what the whole discussion is about. In terms of that, a lot of people said it earlier on, you know, this is not a yesterday thing. This is from years and decades. You know what I mean? It's not a new thing. You know what I mean? A lot of us been fighting the struggle for many, many years. Yeah. And the frustration is that people have it as a new thing. You know what I mean? You know, the reports have been repeated over and over and over again. You know what I mean? And that's my biggest frustration, really, is to, you know, yes, we see change, but let's do something to actually make change happen. And, you know, whether we'll see change, we have to wait and see. But like I said, this is nothing new. You know what I mean? I always say to people, in terms of thankful for Premiership football, which has that stuff flying a flag, so to speak, on the front page. And stuff like that, really. So, you know, that's my little 2 cents in terms of that.
Thank you, Brian. Did anyone have anything else to say at that point in time?
Can I just jump in?
Yes.
And say about, you know, that I think that racism is everywhere in that way, or, you know, discrimination based on how people are seen as others and them. And that happens in lots of different communities around the world, because status is usually linked to something that is embodied and somatic. And And it is also linked to questions about somatophobia, isn't it, as well, and kind of how others are connected to doing the dirty work and more embodied than the elite groups who are seen as being very different. So I think all of, whichever culture you're in around the world, there will be hierarchies that are linked to racial and ethnic differences. And I think, so yes, we are dealing in, Leicester is a multicultural city with people from all over the world, and they all have different versions of, how they kind of stratify the world and what they think is all right. But I think what's interesting is that politics crosses over those communities. So the politics of the elite or trying to keep or maintain power will, cross over to other elites who might be racialized differently or ethnically, but they will kind of, and I was quite shocked during the election, actually, but, some of the sort of more right-wing, like Sikh kind of stuff that was coming out advocating for the Conservative Party. It's really quite, I was thinking, oh, look, that's really interesting that you have these kind of conservative people go right across the road. So I think that race and class all intersect, don't they? And that we kind of, it's, it comes out differently in different places. So we have to be able to unpick that, I think, but also challenge the politics of it, I think, more than anything else. Look at the similarities. And
Athina. Yeah, can I say something, Athina?
Of course, yes, go ahead.
Yes. Okay, I think, I mean, I agree with all of them, but I just wanted to sort of point out that Leicester's Indian diaspora has changed quite a lot recently as well, which I don't know whether people are aware of or not. But we have had a lot of people come in with, who are sort of with the Portuguese passport, but they are actually termed as Indians. And that big population has actually come in. They call either from Diu and Daman, which are the two sort of ports in India. So they have a very different way of, obviously culturally different way of living, but that has changed the whole Belgrave area in a way. On one hand, the thing is the penalization that takes place at times. When it suits them, actually, it's comments are made that Indian culture is very strong. They tend to look after each other, so they don't need all the services of support that all the other communities need. So, they can look after their own. And then on the other hand, what people have already mentioned is they are living together, so they must be in overcrowded families and overcrowded in the household. Culturally, they are, as I say, very, very people who are very concerned about how they live. They will always have running water to have their showers and bathing. But when information is actually twisted and turned, it actually gives a totally wrong, derogatory connotation to people who are of color, and it's really quite degrading them when they've, when it suits them. The culture is really powerful, their culture is great, you should be following them, and when it doesn't suit them, it's just actually just taken out of context and then thrown. Especially this pandemic, we've realized. And one other issue that at the moment I think a lot of Indians, I think, are facing is the change in law regarding having priests come over who are priests, qualified priests from abroad, because we don't have a school in England that actually produces them. And they've changed the law recently, so it's so difficult for any of the temples to try and actually get priests in, because they've changed, and it's like it's so suitable to only a religious minister. So all this is so much happening, and as you say, the political people who have the power to change are not there to listen. They're not there to actually support. And these sort of things, people go there trying to fight, and it just doesn't happen. So all I'm saying is basically the whole of Leicester is constantly changing. We've had a lot of people from South India, so it's Tamil speaking, and it's absolutely brilliant to have this in a multicultural society, but their culture is in a way still different. They're all just put into that one bowl of saying, yes, they're all Indians or they're all from South India. and it's not always the case, and these are all changing days and you know, requirements of people.
For this intervention, I mean, it's one of those cases that this can go into all sorts of directions, and I'm here to kind of like keep us on track, like the train, you know, like that thing. So
sorry, that's all.
Thank you. I'm aware that we were supposed to have a break soon and then start again, but I was just thinking whether we can continue a little bit, and if Zakia is here right now, if she can come on now.
I can, yeah.
Thank you, Zakia.
Thank you for having me, Athena, and also for organising this space for us to really reflect on our experiences as a community in Leicester. I wanted to take this conversation actually in a completely different direction, and I hope that you forgive me for that. I want to talk to you all about things that I've been considering over the lockdown, and that's been my role as an educator in light of the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. I completed a postgraduate certificate in academic practice recently, a couple of months ago, and some of the things that came from that analysis really speak to some of the disparities and inequalities that we have in the university sector, and we certainly have in our own organisation as well. So in terms of how this fits to the Black Lives Matter movement and also the pandemic, I think both of these have really, as many people have mentioned, it's really brought these inequalities and divides in our communities to the forefront of debate. And it's making us all think about what about our own institutions. George Cole mentioned earlier that you know, we've had lots of people come out and support movements before, and he's totally right that is the case, but he's also right to say that real action is needed. So I think that this is an important moment perhaps for us all to reflect on what kind of action we will take in light of some of these broader movements in our own communities and in our own cities are taking place. So in terms of Leicester's contribution, University of Leicester's contribution to the city, Claudia Webbe mentioned that earlier, that really got me thinking about what this says about the nature and future of our contribution as an institution in addressing racism and racial disparities, particularly in light of Black Lives Matter and the pandemic, and the fact that we have seen the growth of a movement in Leicester. And it's been great hearing from them today. So I'm going to reflect on some well-known statistics and current diversity practices, and I'd be really interested in hearing about your experiences and thoughts, and also learning from you as colleagues, peers and activists, but also for us to engage in a wider conversation about what is the contribution of our university to the city. So nationally, we know that fewer than 1% of professors are Black, despite relatively high levels of representation in higher education and our history of liberal university culture. But this actually reveals a rather illiberal university culture. And these stats aren't new to us as academics, they're clear to us as we're walking up and down our corridors. And we as an institution, like many others, have responded to these concerns that have been brought to us largely by students, by changing our curriculums, decolonializing them, engaging with students with focus groups, particularly with BAME students, and having BAME specific funding opportunities, for example, teaching fellowships, or I don't know if that's been extended to PhD fellowships, but various universities elsewhere have also got these sorts of practices in place now. On average, that university life cycle from a student to professor takes decades, and we're educating a more diverse number of students in the UK than ever before, and that's amazing in itself. But we do know that there are fundamental barriers in educational institutions that limit Black and ethnic minority participation past undergraduate and MA studies. And that's really where we've got the issue. And I think that as an institution, but also as a sector, we're really still grappling with that self-reflection on this critical issue, despite having made significant advances on at least acknowledging or recognising problems. And I think that this is going to need more than a curriculum change or funding streams, and it's actually where we're going to see the real work begin, and new focus in intellectual inquiry as well. So the second thing I wanted to talk to you about, and maybe raise wider questions about, was the experience of Black and ethnic minority students in academia. We know that there's a considerable attainment gap. So that's the gap between the proportion of white British students that receive higher degree classifications compared to UK domiciled ethnic minority students. And that attainment gap is around 15% or 16%. And it's particularly noticeable amongst Black students that are disproportionately affected by this. But we know that that gap is also narrower in the sciences. And I'm wondering how much attention we're really paying to how we teach in the social sciences, or what we teach. And I think that these questions have been raised before, but it's probably an area where we should really listen to the experiences of our student body, and respond to some of the concerns that they might have in a really meaningful way. So we've got the data. We know that these issues are complex, and it is going to take some time to get to know exactly why we've got some of these issues. And I'm slightly concerned that we're sort of doing all this through Excel spreadsheets, because whenever I've been presented a lot of this stuff, it's through graphs. And I really think that there's some real work to be done and self-reflection. And I think that it's a good time for us to think as an academic community about what kind of individual action we're going to contribute in the context of these broader shifts and movements that we feel so strongly about, and how we can respond to those inequalities and disparities in university education. So I'll leave it there. Thanks for giving me loads to think about. And if you have any thoughts or experiences, do share.
I would like to invite people to do that, actually, if there are any questions here at this point. Nope. Okay, so in that case, I do have
there's two hands up. Sorry, Sharon and John.
Yes. Ah, sorry. Where do you see these hands? And I don't
see them because I have them.
Sorry. Thank God for you, Paula. So it was Sharon and John. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for that reflection, Zakia. I just wanted to speak to you actually and just say hi. But I do also have a question off the back of what you said. I think at the moment what we've seen a lot of, especially during the lockdown, was sort of these toppling of statues and conversation around toppling statues. And I guess it's a question, but also to add to that reflection, like I think universities also have a long way to go in recognizing that, you know, a lot of the privileges that afforded to universities was built off the back of colonialism and things like that. And sometimes I think why students are having the struggles they are in institutions is the lack of acknowledgement of that and trying to sort of wash over that. So I guess the question is, what do universities need to do to sort of recognize that and tell, you know, the Black and brown students that are actually in those communities that we acknowledge that this has happened, and now we're here to, you know, listen to you to move forward with that. What do universities have to do to sort of make acknowledgement of that? I know there's not always statues on every ground that we can topple, but what can they do to start acknowledging some of those colonial legacies?
I think that universities really need to be, I think transparency is the word. I think that's what people are really calling for. They're calling for transparency, they're calling for conversations and dialogues. Not everybody is actually looking for something to look at, you know? something physical. And I think that in some contexts it's appropriate, and that will happen in a lot of institutions. But I think in Leicester in particular, I think that from what I found with some of the interviews and focus groups that I ran with students just as the lockdown came in, is that they want conversations to take place in a way where they feel heard. And I don't think that we've quite created those spaces, but I do find it really interesting that a lot of these conversations are happening and in the context of this pandemic. So people are not, despite and in spite of all of that, there's actually a huge amount going on. And I'm a little bit worried that because we are in a university context and we're going to be focused on teaching, that actually as institutions, we're not going to engage with BLM and these broader issues as strongly enough because we'll be struggling with other things. But I think that that call for action that George mentioned earlier on, I think it's very real. And I think that, yes, we're not going to be able to fix things straight away, but those inequalities that we've talked about and those disparities even in the attainment gap, they are obvious to us, and we should be really attuned to them in the classroom, when we're in meetings, whatever it is that we're doing. I think it's got to start off on a very basic level. We can't just have lots of people that are supporting a movement, but I think these inequalities are very clear to anybody who works in a university context. And I think that those are also the conversations that we should be having amongst ourselves. And it's not just about student and institution conversations alone, although that is important.
I want to, if that's okay, thank you, Zakia, to take the question from John and move on to Will Green, please, right next up, if that's okay. So John.
I'll just be very quick, Zaki. You're absolutely right. I mean, we've actually just spent a few days interviewing for the BAME scholarships, which has been fantastic. We have fantastic applicants. Is that enough? No. We've got the BAME PGT scholarships. Is that enough? No. And I think a consensus, and Paul's joined us now, the consensus of those that have been involved is that we need to be addressing the issues much, much sooner. And you know, the undergraduate curriculum that we teach is not robust enough, hence the need to decolonise. And just a quick comment, you know, for me, it came to life a few years ago when a black student from Brixton said to me, can I write about my family's experience in Brixton? And I just thought, the student, this was a third year student, who got to the final year of a degree and was asking that question. And I just thought, we failed that student. We failed that student. We failed them totally. That they've got so far, and it's only at the end that they start to ask the questions about how all this relates to themselves. That's for me was a real turning point. And you know, welcome the decolonisation work. I think we've got to make the degrees relevant to the life experiences of the students. Totally relevant to the life experience of the students. So anyway, it was just a comment. I think we are moving forward, but there's a lot more to do.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, someone's made a comment here. Sorry, Athina, I'm like eating your time. Can you guys see me, by the way?
Yes, we can.
Oh, you can, because I can't see myself, so that's good.
That's
you
good.
Want to carry on, but I'll respond via.
Please, it's just the reason I want Will on is because I've been trying to get him on because he has like his parenting kind of like interruptions. So I'm trying to be trying to do that. Is it okay to take Will in and then continue this discussion if that's okay? I'm mindful.
Athina, I'm hoping things will be. I've got 3 small children. I keep dashing off, but I think I'll be fine. So Zakia, if you want to come back.
Great.
I forgot what I was going to say, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you, Will. Zakia.
Can you, yes, what was I going to say? Okay. Yeah, I can really relate to that student in Brixton, actually, because, so I studied history until A-level and then did a degree in area studies. And but until A-level, yeah, I've never, you can go through, I know it's part of a bigger issue. We have students and young people that go through entire educational systems, private or state, that do not see themselves in the curriculum. So I didn't learn anything. So I learned about World War I, didn't learn anything about, or really, really minimal about people that were from my family and lots of other families from the subcontinent. And I think that experience, if you get that at university, can be particularly problematic. And I think that we have probably the last opportunity in that educational cycle to do something about that. But I think you're totally right on doing something earlier. That is really, really key.
Thank you, Zakia. Will, please.
Hi. Thanks, Athina. Thanks, everyone. Thanks asking me to come and talk, Athina. And all of the speakers that I've heard have been really inspiring. I'm from Leicester. Obviously, I'm a white male, so my experiences are very different to everyone else. But so I'm not a sociologist. I think most of the discussions here have been sociological, from the academics at least. I'm in a business school, so I'm talking from a slightly different take on things, and I study technology, particularly in technology in healthcare, where I'm doing most of my work at the moment. And so there's a few things I was going to speak to. I also have a role within the university where I look at the impact of our research, and there's a National Trust report being published next week by one of our colleagues, Corinne Fowler, who's been studying the colonial histories of a lot of the National Trust properties. And there's a National Trust report coming out next week, which is currently embargoed, and it's already been associated with some very misleading representation in the tabloid press. But hopefully, when it is published next week, some more accurate representations of that work will be published. I also mentioned earlier Nick Hammer's work in relation to impact and the textile industry in Leicester. And there are other colleagues that we have in Leicester who are trying to study some of these very, and having impact in these areas. But the work I'm doing in relation to COVID is in colleagues at University of Birmingham, where we're trying to look at some of the responses that have been put in place as a result of COVID, particularly around technology and healthcare and the healthcare system. Obviously, COVID has demonstrated some very extensive inequalities in some parts of the healthcare system. And we're looking at one of the big things that happened overnight, amazingly, in the National Health Service was remote consultations to minimize and reduce the chances of infection between patients and our medical staff. They put in place remote consultations, but some of the consultants that I talk to and are starting to work with are concerned over what the implication is of those changes in practice. So I think the ramifications of the amazing responses that have been put in place, we will need to continue to research, as certain groups of the population will be adversely affected by those changes, which the health service from a cost point of view will want to retain them. Also through my PhD students, in relation to what I heard of the last speaker. So my PhD student, we all have a number of PhD students, but my PhD student in Leicester have had some really terrifying encounters through COVID. So she's a Chinese student, but also some very positive ones. So she's experienced really negative and positive within the Leicester community, going about normal daily lives. And the other thing I was going to say is being a business school scholar. So business schools are present at all universities. There's over 120 universities nationally. Nearly all of them have a business school. So we have a real responsibility to educate students. We've been working with colleagues across the university around climate change and how the responsibility of business schools in in the climate change. So how our education has inadvertently reinforced some of the systems that have led to a continued, overuse of resourcing within, the global resources, which has led to climate change. And I think there's a position there. There's obviously a lot of work, high publicity work that's been done across campuses nationally around decolonizing the curriculum. And I think there's still a huge amount of work that needs to be done there. And so hopefully at colleagues at Leicester, we will start to do some of that work.
This is a perfect introduction, actually. If Paul is here, Paul Campbell, who works on ethnicity and local football in Leicester, maybe the history of ethnicity of Leicester, and but more broadly, if you're here, Paul, you would be
I'm here.
Starting at a very good introduction by Will.
Okay, I mean, interesting, and following Will, we're involved in doing a lot of decolonizing work, and actually can talk about that in the Q&A afterwards. But I suppose what I'm going to talk about today or here is something, the place of local sport within this kind of Black Lives Matter and within this kind of COVID conversation, something that hasn't really been discussed. So really sort of thinking about how, on the one hand, professional football has shown a real solidarity with Black Lives Matter movement in a symbolic way, and there's now questions over whether that translates into meaningful inclusion policies and meaningful outcomes. And this is sort of very, a lot of people are quite skeptical of this. And so this is evident really in the lack of consideration by the game's governing bodies to the potential for local football to widen the health-related disparities and mortality rates between Britain's white and BAME communities, and here in Leicester. So that's kind of what I'm going to speak about over the next sort of few minutes or so. So on May 26th, professional football restarted, and the negative mortality rates, extremely high mortality rates among BAME communities prompted some commentators, academics, scholars and footballers to question how safe this was for Black players. And last Saturday, the local game, which serves 6,000 clubs across the country, restarted on Saturday. But there's been much less public scrutiny, particularly over local football as a conduit through which COVID can reach our most vulnerable communities. So in effect then, that's really surprising here in Leicester, given that Leicester has local football is a real place in Leicester's history and the history of its minority ethnic communities. So you don't have to go far in the city to meet someone whose family or friends or daughter or son or cousins have played for one of the local clubs, Highfield Rangers, Nirvana, Ikra, and so on. But this being said, much of the health-related policies have focused on actually playing the game. Now, outdoor sports and outdoor activities and the low contact rate means that transmission is really unusual. And so local football is really, really safe, or outdoor football. And so as such, much of the kind of protective measures are focused on players and on the people directly involved in the game. So perhaps, I suppose, unsurprisingly, there appears to have been little consideration given by the football authorities to football to double up as a conduit for the transmission of COVID directly into those BAME communities they serve. So on one hand, you've got the relatively low risk of transmission when playing outdoors, combined with the general sort of health and young age and physical condition of most of the people that play, means that actually those that play, the men and women and girls and boys who play, are relatively, it's unusual that they will develop the kind of severe symptoms or have the underlying conditions that we've seen cause the kind of negative and severe impact of COVID. But the problem here is that ultimately local football is not confined to just 22 players. The BAME players and the clubs are directly plugged into the very families, households and communities where the impact of COVID is most lethal. And here lies the problem for the football authorities. Many BAME clubs double up as important community venues. Local black clubs in the city often have funerals, wakes, and sort of a whole host of other community functions. A lot of South Asian clubs are directly connected to local places of worship. And the problem is that actually many of the footballers and the people that go to the games are not immune from the virus. Only last week in County Durham, 300 local people had to be quarantined because of an outbreak at a game. So what does this mean? Undoubtedly, kind of restarting local football is going to provide some social, psychological and health related benefits. Local football also has been a remarkable space for activism. In the 1980s, Highfield Rangers was a really important place in the Black uprisings. However, if there's no serious consideration given to how local football might also provide another channel through which COVID will directly reach our most vulnerable communities and further widen these disparities that we've seen, then we kind of have a real significant oversight here. And it's really only once the FA and government recognise the realities of BAME communities, their clubs and the players, and place these as a central consideration within its policies, can it really start to live up to its claim that Black Lives Matter also. So I think I'll draw a pause there.
Thank you, Paul. I think what we're gonna do now is we're gonna open up for questions. So I don't know if anyone has want to kick us off with a round of questions. Okay, there's some silence. I have a question. I would like to know a little bit about the sort of the question of the football, okay, but generally more in sports, because there have been some spectacular there was the tennis player and like wearing the masks of people that have been murdered by police and so on. What do you think? Is this having some sort of impact, or is it some kind of celebrity activism and so on? I was just wondering about that for quite some time now, so I thought you might be the person to answer me this question, Paul.
Yeah, I think it's been really, really remarkable by how many sports people, black, white, South Asian onwards, across a whole host of sports, their activism, and that these haven't been shut down by the authorities of those games. I think while this activism is genuine, I think in most cases that this is about a kind of genuine reaction, not just a commercial opportunity. I think that the problem is at the moment it seems to be completely the players who are really kind of showing all the commitment, and it's really now for the authorities to kind of match that commitment in meaningful policies and meaningful outcomes and change, and sort of move beyond the symbolic and show this in their policies and their inclusion agendas going forward.
Thank you. I don't know if there are any questions from either the audience or the participants, or anyone has something to say at this point. So I'm just gonna wait. Otherwise, I think it looks like we're gonna be finishing a bit earlier, which might not be a bad thing. So if no one has anything, I'm just gonna give you another chance here. If there's something pressing.
I've got a question.
Yes, please.
Yeah. One of the things that we've seen that this pandemic and the lockdown is highlighted is that the pandemic, not only does it feed on inequality, it also highlights those inequalities. And Leicester, talking specifically about Leicester, is that Leicester tends not to talk about those inequalities. Instead, what it tends to do is it tends to go into celebratory mode. This is how most people understand Leicester. They understand the celebratory, where Leicester celebrates that it is multicultural, everyone lives happily together, and that narrative hides the inequalities. For example, George Cole found that there's a pay gap between white employees and black employees in Leicester City Council, and that the pay gap was actually significant. I think there was about a 10% pay gap. And the DWP, Department of Work and Pensions, found that if you're black, you are 10% less likely to find employment in Leicester than if you're white. The question is, what can the city do to show that, what would a city that where Black Lives Matter be like? What needs to happen for Leicester to demonstrate that Black Lives Matter in this city? This is for everyone.
Okay. Who wants to have a go at this one?
I'll just say something. Just to say something. I lived in Leicester for 20 years. I don't live in Leicester anymore. I live in Bristol, just Bristol Bath. And so I was in Bristol when they brought down the Edward Colston statue, and then rolled it down the street like a tin can and threw it into the river, the same river where slaves were disembarked. And so Bristol and Bath are dealing with a history of slavery and how their city has benefited from the profits of slavery, and they're kind of dealing with that in a very honest way. But in Leicester, there's this idea that they don't have those kind of colonial collections, or they don't have to do, you're not walking down streets named by slaveholders, or you don't go into buildings that are named after slave owners, and there isn't that kind of the same thing there. And I think that has but when you look under the surface, I always thought that Leicester was really segregated, as lots of the community was very segregated into different little pockets where minorities lived. There was very little cross-cultural interaction. I came from London. I found it really, I didn't find it very multicultural at all. I found that people just didn't really mix. And I think there's this myth that Leicester is a very diverse city and that it's all very multicultural. But if you scrape under the surface, that isn't really the case. And okay, they didn't have race riots in the 1980s, like London did or Liverpool did. But so that also adds to this myth that Leicester is a kind of racially harmonious sort of city. But I think it's one that's not really true, and that nobody really still talks about race in a very open way. And I think maybe that's what people need to do a bit more, is sort of think about how do you open up these difficult discussions to actually talk about race and differences, and maybe come to terms with that. And also how colonial systems of power actually shaped Leicester, because the textile industry, which you know, has been a scandal with the garments and the exploited labourers. Like the textile industry really was part of in the Industrial Revolution. You know, it relied on cotton from slave plantations in the US and India, and then it relied on cheap labour from India being brought here. So, you know, those kind of ties, those colonial ties are still, the legacies of those are still here, but the way we treat migrant workers are very different depending on where they come from, because we do have this hostile environment that kind of looks at, you know, kind of racializing immigration policies, really. So I think we just need to kind of be much more honest and not celebrate diversity, but actually talk about the difficulties, the nitty-grittiness of people's different experiences, because there's a real silencing of that, I think, and especially in what Saskia is saying about in the university as well. You know, that the university sector, I think, is really very quiet on how they're implicated in reproducing knowledge that reinforces racisms of different sorts and sort of inequalities, and how they construct some knowledge as being valuable and other knowledge as not. So what John was saying about that student who wanted to talk about his family, I mean, that hasn't been sort of put into the curriculum. There's been no place for that because it hasn't been seen as a valuable knowledge, of a form of valuable knowledge, isn't it, that we need to have. And I think we really need to have really honest discussions, reflexive discussions about how do we change how we approach decolonizing. What would it look like for Leicester as well? You know, who are we and where do we start? And have these really difficult questions to sort of think about and mull around, because at the moment I think we have very different ideas of who we are and where we are in terms of how we're, you know, how our anti-racist practice is going. So some people think we're doing quite well, other people think we're not. I think there has to be a real discussion about like where are we and what are we and what would that look like.
Can I add to that, Athina?
Of course, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think just to echo Jackie's points, and it's what Gurpel-Singh described as parallel existences within the city. So you have on one level a kind of very kind of pro-multicultural, pro-melting pot discourse, which has been maybe fostered through much of the post-80s riots and sort of local government reaching out to communities. So when we look in the public sector, we see a really kind of interesting multicultural map of people being able to access local government. But at the ground level, when you look at maybe in the spatial and geography of the city, and as well as this kind of social and cultural map, that we do see these still very kind of parallel existences that aren't maybe, that don't characterize other cities like London, Birmingham, where there is much more kind of cross-ethnic connection. But I think kind of, so that's the first point. I think there's almost kind of two discourses running in the city. You've got this one that the city presents itself, and you've also got this kind of ground level reality, and maybe the two don't always connect. I think the other point about decolonizing is really interesting. And part of the problem that we have with decolonizing and kind of doing much of this initial groundwork into the university's decolonizing project is that we kind of have this situation where we've had 20 years of inclusion policies, which we've all subscribed to, and that have almost kind of made doing race relations obsolete. So what we still have is this struggle to kind of really place race within decolonizing. We kind of want to talk about a whole host of other things and say, well, decolonizing also includes class, it also includes gender. It does include all these things, but it starts at a racial base. It starts at race and class, race and gender, you know, kind of going back to the notion of intersectionality, that intersectionality which has happened as well, that we can almost have a conversation about intersectionality without talking about race. Whereas actually, when you go back to the original theorizing of intersectionality, it was about the complications of other modes of our social identities in addition to race. So really, there's a kind of whole way of going against, I think, some of our natural inclinations to kind of gravitate to broader, wider inclusion policies and discourse. But actually, what's really happening is that those broader inclusion discussions, even with the best of intentions, have actually worked against equalizing racial disparities. I'm sorry, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, well, that was good. So is there anyone else that wants to? I've had such a great time, can I just say, but that's complimenting myself. But I did enjoy a lot. It's the second time I do a 4-hour situation like this, but I enjoyed this one much better than the previous one. So there you go. If anyone wants to intervene now, they're very welcome.
Can I just say something quickly? Oh, sorry. You can go ahead.
Paula wants to talk, I think, for a little bit of time, but she hasn't had a chance.
Yeah. No, I mean, really quickly, and I'm so tired because I've been really paying attention and doing Twitter and stuff, so I hope I can get the words out. But I just wanted to thank you all for your really fascinating contributions and just highlighting again things that have been said. But I think it's so important to have these spaces where we can share different perspectives and different experiences. And particularly, I'm thinking about the issue of the intersection of class and race and how they manifest in different contexts and different examples that were presented and discussed. And, from my perspective, I've been following what's been happening in Latin America and different countries, a context that's very different to the UK or to other parts of culture in terms of how race and class operate. And I think that by listening to reflections, both like experience and theorization about other contexts, that helps us understand where we are better and how to also organize with others. Specifically about COVID, about Black Lives Matter, but about other issues such as climate change as well. Because I think one of the barriers, it is one of the issues in this country is that sometimes the climate movement doesn't really understand the reality of global South countries and how people are experiencing extraction there. So yeah, I really value this space, and thanks, Athina, for organizing, and thank you for everyone for staying throughout. That was all I want to say.
Thank you, Paula. There was yeah.
Can I just say one tiny little thing, Athina?
Of course.
Okay. I totally agree with the couple of other previous speakers about how Leicester is just so segregated, what Jackie said, and I think what Paul said as well. One of the ways I think whoever is in charge of, letting Leicester celebrate certain festivals, they do it in those specific areas. So say, for example, Diwali is in Belgrave, Eid is in Highfields, so, Vaisakhi is whatever. Now that is going to segregate those communities even further. Instead of just trying to mix them and go there for that one day, it should become a sort of a local national holiday when everybody's celebrating in a capacity. I come from Africa and India, where they actually have these days for everyone to celebrate together, and they know about all the festivals. That actually brings communities together. It's just one way of thinking, but we need to start thinking about it. People sometimes say we don't celebrate Christmas. Why do we have holiday? But why can't we have holidays on certain days when it is our New Year's Day? So if we start respecting nationally certain ideas like this, then we will actually make more of a reason. And the other point is, when people have the immigrants who have come in, they have just been put into those areas. So that's why they form little ghettos. They don't have the choice of saying, I want to go to this area to live. And then they become so familiarized with their own area. I mean, for myself, I've lived in one area. I've been in that area since 48 years. So you can see how long I have been here. And I have seen the whole change in Belgrave from all the different communities and ethnicity. So all I'm saying is I probably have a lot more to offer, and I've seen the changing faces, and I think community leaders would have a lot to input this to make it make a big difference in changing and you know, moving away from these ghettos and segregation. But they need to be on to be able to make that difference, and everybody needs to come together.
Thank you. Thank you, Bartia. So on that note, unless somebody else has any other contribution to make, I don't want to stop you if people feel like that they want to share more. Otherwise, yeah. Thank you all for such a, I mean, I learned a lot from this, and thank you for coming and giving us your thoughts and your time and being willing to share, because some of these experiences are painful. So thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye, bye, bye.
Bye.